are witnessing unprecedented challenges, there are many success stories which demonstrate that with careful thought and locally focused planning and design, new development combined with thoughtful community participation can foster and provide stewardship over the built environment in ways that are in greater harmony with nature. Today's speakers will be looking more closely at the cause and effect relationships between nature and buildings and landscapes. I'm really excited to learn from such distinguished presenters. I want to thank our city staff for their hard work in putting together today's program. In particular, our interdepartmental green team made up of Robin Eason from Long Range Planning, Helen Collins and Erin Hamant from Facilities and Recreation Services, Christina Sarkis from our Urban Design and Architecture Studio, and our amazing Andy Lovano from the City Manager's Department. I want to thank my colleagues for supporting this effort, Council members John D'Amico, Seppi Shine, and Councilmember John Erickson, and Mayor Lindsay Horvath. Today's program will be moderated by Rick Abramson, our fantastic city architect and manager of the Urban Design and Architecture Studio. Rick joined the city about 1.5 years ago after a 30-year career in professional practice. Since he's joined the city, he has helped establish the studio and focus the design of new projects on greater alignment with our local climate, heightened building performance, and creative ways to expand our green and open spaces. Again, welcome to today's event, and please join me in welcoming Rick to start off our program this morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to have you join us today. We appreciate the support of our City Council, and as our Mayor Pro Tem said, this was a collaborative effort among staff, and we're really excited to bring the symposium to you today. The quality of life for city dwellers is enhanced by their local urban forest. Both its plant and animal life provide vital contributions that ensure pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, reinforce a sense of community, combat heat island effects, reduce energy demand, manage stormwater and erosion, and enhance air quality. Within West Hollywood's dense urban context, the urban forest often represents our best opportunity for daily interaction with nature. Maintaining biodiversity through a thoughtfully curated effort that stewards both the natural and built environment together as one is critical in meeting our city's commitment to climate change and sequestering carbon, filtering and processing stormwater, propagating wildlife habitats, and most importantly, producing the oxygen we breathe. Today's virtual symposium will bring together our West Hollywood community with experts that we're so excited about on the natural and built environment to discuss this broad-ranging topic through 4 specific lenses. So we're going to begin by looking at a more global perspective at learning about green, blue, and brown infrastructure to maintain sustainable cities. Our second speaker will touch on the LA Basin's tree canopy and urban spaces from a historical and current perspective. After a brief break, we'll come back and look at the Bioscan project through the Natural History Museum and their search for diversity within the wildlife in the LA Basin. And then lastly, we'll focus a little bit on design and going forward with the built environment and how we can learn lessons from nature and how nature can actually inspire better design. So today's program is meant to be a locally oriented perspective on biodiversity and urban forestry stewardship methods. We'll look at best practices for restoration and regeneration of our urbanscapes and ways to monitor how land use policies and nurtured ecosystems can remain in dynamic balance going forward. So I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Yuzhen Chen. Dr. Chen has a longstanding interest in human natural systems, including forests, soils, water, and their interactions with human decisions and activities. She is working to explore the impacts of human policies and behavior on urban ecosystems, develop effective mitigations, and provide healthy land, clean water, and equitable urban green spaces for all. Dr. Chen is co-author of the first global guidelines on urban and para-urban forestry, which aims to optimize the contribution of forests and trees to sustainable urban development. These guidelines specifically touch on food, energy, water, land and soils, green economies, biodiversity, human health, and well-being. During her work with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, she also co-developed an online module for their Sustainable Forest Management Toolbox. Currently, Dr. Chen is a Senior Manager of Urban Forestry Policy in the Department of Policy and Research at the environmental nonprofit organization Tree People here in Los Angeles, and is leading the Healthy Soils for Healthy Communities initiative to study the role of soils in building climate resilience and healthy communities in Los Angeles. Dr. Chen joined the USC School of Architecture this year and is teaching a course in advanced topics in urban ecology. So Dr. Chen, welcome. We're excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Rick. Let me share my screen now. Actually, it said disabled. Could you change me maybe as a co-host so I can share my screen?
I'll do that for you right now.
1 minute.
Thank you. While we are waiting, good morning, everyone. And feel free to type your name and the city you are calling from and say hi to each other in chat. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Oh, and Dr. Chen, if I may, encourage everybody that we would love questions through the Q&A function within Zoom. And we will be having a Q&A after the second speaker. So please do provide questions as we go. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you very much, Rick. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be here to talk about green, blue, and brown infrastructure for sustainable cities from a global perspective. Before we start, as I said, let's take some time to learn a bit more about our audience today. So feel free to type your name and the city you are calling from in Q&A and say hi to each other. If you are calling from the city of West Hollywood, please add which neighborhood you are calling from. And I heard we also have some international audience here too. And I already see one of my colleagues from USC answer here. So good morning, everyone. Okay, let's see. We have Yves from Alhambra, and we have Leslie from Studio City. We have Emilio from West Hollywood, and Lisa from LA. Wow, great. Yeah, so please type your name and the place you're calling from and say hi to each other in Q&A. So we definitely got a very diverse audience today. Thank you for taking the time for joining us today, and especially to talk about cities. And this is a nightlife map from NASA, and it shows, where we are located or where we live. For example, here, this is LA, and I think that's where the majority of us currently live. And as you can see, there are different cities in different regions, and but the density are a little bit different. Some parts are brighter than others. That means they are more dense than others. So globally, we have 55% of the world population lives in urban area, and this number is going to increase to 68% by 2050. At the same time, our climate is changing too. Based on the newly published State of Global Climate 2020 report, the concentration of the major greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, nitric oxide, continued to increase in 2019 and 2020. Global mean temperature in 2020 is on course to be one of the 3 warmest on record. And sea level had increased, and recently sea level has risen at a higher rate and heavy rain and extensive flooding occurred over large parts of Africa and Asia last year. The United States had a record number of storms during the North Atlantic hurricane season, and severe drought affected many parts of interior South America last year. Most recently, our own Governor Newsom declared drought emergency in 2 California counties here. So the question becomes, how can we provide sufficient resources, a good environment, and quality of life for all? In 2015, the United Nations member states have adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, as part of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and prospects of everyone everywhere. So as you can see here, the SDG number 11 is to make cities and human settlement inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So I'm very glad the city of West Hollywood is hosting this symposium today, so we could discuss how can we make our cities more inclusive, safer, more resilient, and sustainable together. So when you think about cities, what's the first thing coming to your mind? Feel free to share your thoughts in chat. Over the years, I had opportunities either to visit or to live in many cities around the world, and here are just some of them. When you look at cities, large or small, either here in North America or in Europe or in Asia and Africa, they share something in common. When you look at a city, it's like a marriage between nature and the built environment. And especially during this COVID-19 pandemic, and more people realize how important the nature is to us. Within the nature environment, we have green infrastructure, for example, trees, plants, and other vegetation. We also have blue infrastructure, which is water. And the brown infrastructure, the soil, sometimes it's hard to see because they're underneath of our feet. So for those green, blue, and brown infrastructure, they're just as important as other gray infrastructure we see every day, like pipes or roads in the city. So what is green infrastructure? So this is a definition by European Commission. So the green infrastructure is a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural area with other environmental features designed and managed to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services, such as water purification, air quality, space for recreation, and climate mitigation and adaptation. And you might have a question, what is ecosystem services? So in short, ecosystem services are the benefits people derive from ecosystem. So this is a great infrastructure. What about blue? When we look at cities, especially when we compare nature environment with urban environment, when it comes to water, we have reduced evaporation. We have significantly increased runoff and reduced infiltration too. So stormwater runoff becomes a big issue for many cities. And for the city like Philadelphia, it chose green over gray for its stormwater management, because the question becomes, how can we use nature-based solution when it comes to stormwater management? So it has been proven to be a successful model. When you use green infrastructure for stormwater management, it's more cost effective, and also it can provide other co-benefits too. Especially here in LA County, we just started this Safe and Clean Water program to incorporate nature-based solution for stormwater management. And the brown infrastructure too, the soil part, because soil is the foundation of life. It is the brown infrastructure for the city because the blue, and the green and the brown, they go hand in hand, and also they interact with each other. Globally, about 95% of our food comes from soil. And soil store and filter water and providing food security and our resilience to floods and drought. And also it hosts about 1/4 of our planet biodiversity. For example, 1 teaspoon of healthy soil can have up to 1 billion bacteria. And it stores more carbon too. So the soil stores more carbon than the atmosphere and terrestrial vegetation combined. When we think about climate change, carbon sequestration, and greenhouse gas reduction, soil could be a big carbon pool. That's why recently at Two People, we just launched this Healthy Soil for Healthy Community initiative, and to look at the potential of soil for building climate resilience and also healthy communities. So those are the 3 big components: green, blue, and brown infrastructure when we think about the natural environment in the city. So now let's dive in a bit more with the green infrastructure, especially urban forests, because urban forests are the backbone of the green infrastructure. So when we think about urban forest, they take all form. They could be trees you see along the street, in a park nearby, or in your own backyards. And trees have a long history in cities. For example, you can see trees in ancient cities like Rome. You can also see them in modern buildings like the vertical forest in Milan. So why forests are so important, especially when we think about biodiversity, when we think about sustainable cities, when we think about public health. Based on the most recently published The State of the World's Forest, and forests host most of the Earth's terrestrial biodiversity. For example, forests provide habitats for 80% of amphibian species, 75% of bird species, 68% of mammal species, and about 60% of all vascular plants are found in tropical forests. So how we manage our forests, our natural resources, are going to have a critical impact on biodiversity. Trees can also clean air and cool the city, based on a global study conducted by the Nature Conservancy. When we invest in $100 million annually in tree planting, it can provide 77 million people with cooler cities and 68 million people with cleaner air. And trees can also sequester carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and indirectly help with energy reduction. So this is a national study with 28 cities and 6 states in the US. Novak and his colleagues found the total tree carbon stored in the US urban area is estimated at 643 million tons, and the annual sequestration is estimated at 25.6 million tons. When we think about climate change, carbon sequestration, and trees can directly sequester carbon and also indirectly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And also it's related to public health too, because it happens very often and people just think trees are either nice to have or maybe it's too luxury to maintain, but it's not that. It's the basic needs we need every day because it's related to our life every day. So based on a recent study of 3 people led, the Los Angeles Urban Cooling Collaborative, we found that 1 in 4 human lives could be saved from being lost to extreme heat in LA if we strategically increase in tree canopy cover and cool services, especially in low-income communities and communities of color, because those communities are usually have low tree canopy, and also when it comes to climate impact, they are more vulnerable. So those are the benefits of trees. Let's look at a couple of case studies. Take London as an example. Based on the finding from the iTree Eco project, in London, there are 8.4 million trees. And for those trees, it provides at least 133 million pounds, which is about 182 million US dollar every year in terms of air pollution removal, carbon sequestration, and also reducing of the amount of water going to the drain. And it's worth noting that the trees in London can also support and are closely associated with a wide range of priority species, such as birds and butterflies. At the same time, there are challenges too. So when we look at the Melbourne's urban forest strategy, and it outlines the main challenges for the urban forest we have. For example, climate change, pest and disease, the increase in population and density. So this is true. It's not just for Melbourne, Australia, and also for many cities across the globe, including LA here, because we have the changing climate, emerging pest and disease, land development, and also increasing population and the demand. So how can we make sure we can provide all the benefits we needed? However, in reality, our tree canopy is declining. In the US, this is a national study for the US. We have the declining urban and community tree cover due to drought, pest and disease, urban land development, fire, and many other factors. For example, in California, from 2009 to 2014, tree canopy has decreased from 39.4% to 39%. There are equity and environmental justice issues too, because studies show that there's a strong positive correlation between urban tree canopy cover and median household income. What does that mean? That means, generally speaking, the wealthier the community is, the greener it will be. So this is the photo you see here. This is a photo from two towns in South Africa. As you can see, they're next to each other. But when you look at the community on the left, it's much greener than the community on the right. So when we think about urban forest management, it's not just for urban forest, and also this is related to equity and environmental justice too. So you might ask, so what can we do? What can we do to address those issues? And what are the core principles we could follow when it comes to urban green infrastructure planning? So according to an article by Laurel et al., and there are 7 core principles you could think about. First of all, think about cities and ecosystem. They're all connected. This is network and connectivity. Think about the connection between green, blue, brown, and also other components within the urban ecosystem. And also think about multifunctionality and multi-benefits. When we do any design and planning, think about what are the co-benefits this could provide. And also integrating gray, green, blue, and brown. And think about the scale. There are many scales we can do. It could be at the size scale, it could be at a city scale, regional scale, or global scale. And also we have to be strategic, be proactive, and work with a diverse group, use an inter or transdisciplinary approach to address the needs, to address the issues. And also think about how can we make sure it is socially inclusive. Think about the diverse audience, stakeholder we have. So those are the main core principles. And also there are some guidelines and tools you can use too. For example, as Rick mentioned in the introduction, we have developed this first ever global guideline for urban and peri-urban forestry. Within this guideline, either your interest and priority is biodiversity, climate change, food security, green economy, or land management, or human health and well-being. There are detailed guidelines from the policy to the management level for you to follow. So now we learn trees are good and we need trees, especially in cities. However, there are challenges and threats that we need to address strategically and holistically. The good news is there increased interest and attention on urban forestry. For example, in 2018, the theme of the International Day of Forest was Forest and Sustainable Cities. In the same year, the first World Forum on Urban Forest was held. At the forum, a global call for action was launched. So this is a call for all the cities across the globe and a call for all of us. How can we make our cities greener, healthier, and happier for all? So the take-home message is now we know cities are a living ecosystem with both built and natural environment. With urbanization, climate change, and global pandemic, it becomes urgent. How can we bring nature back to the city? To achieve all the desired benefits and goals, we need to integrate gray with green, blue, and brown infrastructure. Think about above ground, think about the interface, and below ground. And also, we need to build multi-beneficial and multifunctional urban ecosystem. When we think about globally, we need to act locally. All of us need to work together from the policy, planning, to management and community engagement level. So I hope with this, it gives you a test about, a global perspective when we think about sustainable cities, when we think about urban forest, soil, water, biodiversity, what we can do. I hope this is just a starting point because there are a lot of work need to be done, but I hope this is a good start and for us to think about how can we make our cities more sustainable and greener and more climate resilient. And thank you all.
Dr. Chen, thank you so much. I think this was a great way to kick off this morning's conversation. We'll start global and then we'll move more to the local now with focusing in more on the LA Basin and West Hollywood itself. I do want to remind everybody to please share your questions or comments in the Q&A function. We're working on making them visible right now. But I think that will help to inform the Q&A that will follow the presentations today. So please do share. With that, I'm going to introduce our second speaker. After the second speaker, we will be having our first and second speaker come back together and answer some questions for you. So Dr. Travis Longcore is an interdisciplinary scholar and seasoned environmental scientist focusing on nature and cities. His extensive experience in sustainability and conservation. He holds a PhD in geography from UCLA with a specialization in biogeography. He taught across town at USC and has now returned to his academic roots as an associate adjunct professor at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. Dr. Longcore is the current science director with the Urban Wildlands Group and serves on the board of directors of the LA Audubon Society, including in the role of board president for 5 years previously. His research includes investigation of the effects of artificial night lighting on wildlife, mapping, modeling, and management of species and habitats, and reconstruction of historical landscapes to better understand current and future land management options. Among his accomplishments in the nonprofit, educational, and consulting sectors, Dr. Longcore co-developed a science-based habitat restoration program and native plant nursery for coastal dune habitats that he then transferred to the program's he transferred the program's operation to a nonprofit that is now training at-risk youth and young adults. Not that he needs other work to do, but as in spare time, he manages a successful captive breeding program for endangered California butterflies, which he continues to oversee as well. So thank you, Dr. Longcore, for spending time with us today and diving deeper into the opportunities and challenges related to climate and our local urban forest. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you, Yujuan, for the talk. It's good to see you here today. And I have to add, I'm going to try to share my screen here, but I'm still disabled. So you look back over a certain number of years and you say, yeah, I was involved in those things. And but the one thing I have to say whenever I hear my things in an introduction is none of these things are ever done alone. There are many people, collaborators across the basin and the world who contribute, and really appreciate the interdisciplinarity and the collaboration that comes along with doing environmental work. So what I wanted to talk about today, given the global introduction and importance about urban forests that we just heard, is really zoom in and talk specifically about West Hollywood, its tree canopy, its vegetation, and sort of bridge also between the urban forest as it is today and the biodiversity that's supported by our landscapes. So this is going to be a walk down a long memory lane. If you could have seen the last 150 so years of development in the Los Angeles basin. This is the first topo map that was put out by the Army Corps, the Geological Survey. This is already showing is about late 1800s. There's already a couple of hundred years here of human urbanization, and it is on land that was occupied and used and tended extensively before that for 9,000 years or so by the Tongva, Tatavian, Chumash in the LA basin. And West Hollywood is actually known here back in the late 1800s as Sherman. So this little thing, and you can see the railway road coming across, and that sort of conspicuous angle there that turns into Santa Monica Boulevard. And so there's West Hollywood today in the purple outlining it on the historical map. So we're at right below the edge of the steep bit of the Santa Monica Mountains in the foothills. And there's some interesting things here. And I want to sort of walk through this so we understand the context of what the urban forest is today and where it came from. We've done a lot of work on the historical ecology that I'm drawing on here for this region. This is a view early 1900 exactly, right around Laurel Canyon, looking eastward toward Hollywood. And you can see there's chaparral up here on the hillsides and a bunch of trees down here where you have residences and around the agriculture, but this is all planted. There's relatively little natural forest canopy in West Hollywood proper, with the exception of along the streams, and the sycamores and that would have come alongside the streams down onto the flats here. We did a study some years back on the whole Biona Creek watershed, and West Hollywood sits in the Biona Creek watershed, meaning all of your water drains off down to Biona Creek and out through there to the bay. And I've overlaid the findings from that study over top the outline of West Hollywood and the old topographic map. And so we have these streams and a series of habitats, alkali meadow, wet meadow, valley freshwater marsh. And this big one down here, valley freshwater marsh, is exactly what it sounds like. It's a freshwater marsh. Wet meadow is a grassland that is wet and a little too wet for trees to grow in. And alkali meadow sort of gets wet and dry, and then a lot of salts end up in the soil. And so it has a particular flora that's associated with the salty soils. Now, of course, all of these things here are basically covered by development, but I want to put this here so we understand the context of where we're coming from. So that freshwater marsh might have looked a little bit like that. That's a freshwater marsh. This happens to be a constructed freshwater marsh that's built as part of sort of blue-green infrastructure by the city of Los Angeles in South LA Wetlands Park. But the birds and the vegetation here would have been something that you might have found there in that freshwater marsh there in West Hollywood if you were to go back 150, 200 years. If I look at on here, we can see up into the hillsides, the remaining bits of what we would consider the natural forest in this area around West Hollywood. And there's basically 3 major forest types. These are mapped by the National Park Service for some work that they've done around restoration. And so there's our California black walnut in the blue, coast live oak forest in the green, and California sycamore along some of the streams. And those would have been probably more extensive historically, because I'm overlaying a current vegetation map over the historical topography. And the other interesting feature here is a series of springs. And so these are perennial springs that were draining out of the Santa Monica Mountains. And many of them are still there. And some of our colleagues have actually gone out and traced them, so that we do have this water that was there in the landscape and creating habitats alongside the streams that emitted from them. But the rest of it that wasn't filled in there, we kind of have to guess about what it was exactly. There are records of the sort of plains as the Spanish explorers who wrote, I'm sorry, in the mission era, who were exploring, came through, encountering the native tribes that were here and describing how they were tending the landscape at that time. And basically, best we can understand it is it would have been a scrubby, plain grassland, something like this. This happens to be Riverside, but it's a similar type of habitat with buckwheats and sages, annual wildflowers, and it was burned quite frequently. It was burned annually, many of these areas, by the indigenous peoples who were then displaced and killed in the colonial era. And they were burning it to promote certain plant types that were used for food sources, including chia seeds. So chia is promoted by burning, and they would actually greet some of these the Spanish and give them chia gruel, which was the food that they had as a staple, has a lot of vitamin C, very healthful, and promoted by burning this area. But we can't know with any certainty what exactly it might have looked like. So I'll use this as an example. Also grasses, these are native grasses, cactus on some of the slopes and whatnot. But this landscape, of course, gets utterly transformed through a couple hundred years of grazing and then urbanization. So if we move forward here, the clock, we can see this is Sherman as it was known then in 1922. The railway line is here. This has become Santa Monica Boulevard. It comes up and then extends off in that direction. Sunset's actually up over here near the top. La Cienega coming north-south, and it sort of at that time curved around and turned into Melrose. And then here's Sherwood and the sort of lower part of Melrose after the jog down over here. And so you can look at these historical photos. This is done by Spence, who was basically, people would pay him to stick a camera out the side of an airplane and take pictures of anything interesting. So if it was a advertising shot or a flood or something, and so there's these hundreds and thousands of photographs that we have at the UCLA archives, Air Photo Archives, from Spence that were taken out the side of an airplane with a 50-pound camera. It's quite a feat. But I've looked at literally hundreds of these. And what you start to see is you can recognize things on the landscape. That's a remnant wetland right there. That depression right there that's a little bit darker here as well. And then down over here, this is the remnants of that sort of wetland complex that was found there south of the railway and then Santa Monica Boulevard here in West Hollywood. So it helps us sort of contextualize a little bit what happened. So that would have been this area right down in here that we've mapped as this valley freshwater marsh, and then around that these wet meadows and alkali meadows. So what I've done now is taken that historical ecology and transferred it over on top of a contemporary aerial photograph. And So we can start to see some of the patterns in the contemporary landscape. And you see that except for up in the hills, they don't really match the historical ecology, at least for the areas that we have mapped as wetlands. And also, this doesn't look very much like a scrubby plain anymore either. So we're going to switch this out then and look at it from a satellite using something called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is basically a way to show how much photosynthesis is going on at any particular point on the ground. Sometimes there's things on the ground that fool us, but this is a pretty reasonable approximation. So everything that is dark green is probably tree or grass cover. Things that are the bright darkest red are basically no vegetation whatsoever on these individual pixels. What's interesting is you do really see the outline of the city in some areas, especially the transition over here to Beverly Hills, the transition up into the mountains itself along Sunset. And then we can analyze this using sets of data to figure out what's going on. One thing you might notice here, what I've popped over top of here are the City of Los Angeles historic preservation zones, because one thing that you might have noticed here is this sort of dark green area with lots of trees right north of the east side of West Hollywood here. That's actually a historic preservation zone, overlay zone, and it retains, because it retains the sort of footprint of the development in that area. It allows the vegetation to continue to be quite dense in those areas. So that's one of the things that helps us understand this pattern. And then we have this tool, which I get to brag about Tree People now, since Dr. Chen didn't do it. They've released this tool looking at the canopy viewer it's a canopy viewer for the whole county, and it looks at tree canopy on a parcel by parcel basis. And it aggregates up as you zoom out, and then it gets down into this as you zoom in. And this is available online if you search for that, the tree canopy viewer. And you can see that there's just a wide array of percent cover on a parcel basis within the city of West Hollywood. A lot of cover down here, a lot of cover over here. You see this HPOZ north of West Hollywood, the Spalding Square. And then, of course, some that are almost zero and some that are quite high. And so this is, at this scale, it's simply looking at the parcels. And so I want to zoom in and really sort of look and see what is the status of the canopy here down at the local scale. What contributes to these patterns across the city? And so I've zoomed in here on Plummer Park. And partly because I've been to Plummer Park many times while LA Audubon had its headquarters in the park. And you can see it's right here. And of course, you would expect there to be quite a bit of tree canopy cover in the park. You can also start to see how there's single family, there's residential, low density, high density, and it really pops out here also the importance of the street trees to the overall canopy, especially as we look into some of the higher density development areas or parcels that are developed with the higher intensity of land use. So here it is with just the straight aerial photograph. That's what that turns into when you look at the sort of total photosynthesis that's going on. Again, really pops out the park here in the middle, the importance of the street scape and street tree canopy for high density development that's basically lot line to lot line in some of these instances. And then the important role of lower density development in maintaining a tree canopy within this landscape. So then I can pop back on the parcels and you can see how that variability goes. The one parcel, the biggest parcel for the park, obviously having the very high canopy cover, and then some of these that are down close to zero, and others of which are up to 40 to 60%. I would add that you get kind of the maximum cooling benefit from the canopy when you get up to about 40% canopy cover. As a whole across the basin, I forget the most recent number, maybe Dr. Chen recalls, it's in the 20s on average, but that averages out places that have very high tree canopy cover with places that have very low tree canopy cover. Now, all of this, as Dr. Chen mentioned, is very important to sustainability and our comfort in cities. Shade trees have a series of things that they influence in terms of process. They importantly, and this is, people often don't realize that one of the most important things that shade trees do is reduce air conditioning use. And especially if they shade air conditioning units, they reduce the amount of energy that those units. So the most valuable shade tree around any particular building is always going to be the one that will first shade the air conditioning unit, and then second, give the building shade in the hottest part of the summer. But that then reduces demand at power plants, less energy, that reduces air pollution, that reduces temperature here through reducing outdoor temperatures and lower ozone. We also remove pollutants directly from the air with vegetation. So there's a whole series of ways by which trees in our cities improve the air quality, both directly and indirectly, and reduce our energy consumption. And the comfort then is dramatically different. Estimated surface temperature, just a comparison here between a bare surface and a fully vegetated surface. You're looking at 20 to 30 and maybe even 40 degrees difference of a surface temperature, depending on the time of year, between shaded and not shaded. And when you go even further and look at mean radiant temperature, which takes into account how the human body perceives temperature, having shade is literally a lifesaver for people during extreme heat events. And that's one of the reasons we at UCLA have just embarked on a research project around this, looking at street level interventions to get shade out in the places that it's most needed, using mobility data about where people are being exposed to the hottest temperatures during heat events and need that protection from the direct sun. So I want to talk then, to wrap this up, just a little bit about the trends that we're seeing county-wide. And this is not going to include West Hollywood itself. This is a study that we did with colleagues when I was at USC on the 20 largest cities in the LA basin. And so this is an example. We're looking here just at single family residential neighborhoods. This was concentrated on single family residential neighborhoods because they make up about 40% of the land use, quite important for the tree cover in the basin as a whole. So all these parcels, they're single family. There's a whole bunch of them over the period from 2000 to 2009 that were developed and had additional square footage added in some way or another, whether it's a complete replacement or an addition. So we have this database for the whole county using assessor records. And we took a sample in all these cities and figured out the change in the amount of building area, the amount of tree cover, the amount of grass cover, the amount of hardscape in single family residential neighborhoods over that time period. So this was 2000 to 2009. And so you see here, the greens are the lowest percent cover of each lot with buildings, and the yellows get up higher. That's 2000, and that's 2009. And you can see as I toggle between these two, how a greater proportion of every single family lot during this period, and this is pre-legalization of ADUs and things like that, to any great extent, this is showing just how much more building area we're getting. And then we look here, this is the amount of paved area on these lots during 2000 and 2009. So we see a significant, we went forward, building pavement in 2009. So 2000, 2009, considerable increase. And then we can look what that means for green cover. And there's a significant amount of loss of green cover, meaning trees and shrubs and grass, across the region as a whole. Some much higher than others. Some is 25 to 30, 40%. Others it's only 10 to 15%. But this is significant. And it also is concentrated in some areas that can least afford to lose tree cover, in that they had the least to start with, and are communities that are at risk through underinvestment, historic redlining, discriminatory policies over time. And so we see that this is a significant issue for even within this land use that's the sort of should be the lowest density in terms of impacts. This is just a summary using the data from all of those 20 cities, including the 15 council districts in the city of Los Angeles, showing for those properties that either didn't have any legal additional development or did, and tree cover goes down. It goes down in both, which is interesting, which suggests that people are cutting down trees in addition to just for development. Even in places without additional legal development that's recorded with the assessor, there's additional building cover and additional hard space cover. So this is sort of things that are maybe under the radar. Much greater when there's legal development. But this is a significant trend. And the thing is, these principles don't just apply to single family residential neighborhoods. They're happening in any type of redevelopment situation where the building and hardscape footprint increases. And I'm sorry to say that most redevelopment results in that and doesn't leave space for there to be this sort of functioning part of the ecosystem in terms of tree cover. And as Dr. Chen noted as well, I've just pulled out a different set of data to illustrate the same thing. This is relative change in tree cover over the 2000s in terms of trends. And there's only one city here across the United States in these that were mapped that has a positive trend. And in upstate New York, we are in Los Angeles as a whole, so that means the whole basin and the cities in it, we are like other places around the country that have been losing their tree canopy cover as urban areas are densified and or mansionized, because the two things do essentially the same thing by adding additional square footage. As long as it's additional square footage and more hardscape, that's going to come at the expense of the ecological function. So I wanted to give you that introduction to give some really specific sense about West Hollywood in context, that this forest that we see, and this is a few years old that I took this because the red one isn't here yet, but the forest that you see over there is human created. We've created it and we're now taking it away. And it comes with a cost. And that cost is often not fully appreciated, but there are ways that we can, through code and smart design, and as the afternoon day goes on here, I think we'll hear more about some ideas about how to protect and restore this forest that we created. Also to harken back and recognize some of the ecological history and the features of this landscape and relate it to the native landscape and its biodiversity, because that also enriches our lives in a way that we don't necessarily put a dollar value on. The birds that we see, the butterflies that our urban landscapes support, the flies that you might not think about, but are this really important part of the functioning of the urban ecosystem. So I put my contact information up here. There's an email, that's a Twitter handle. You can find out more about the historical ecology and a bunch of our research at lalandscapehistory.org or bionahe.org, which has that map showing the wetland and wetland associated habitats of the Biona watershed. And there's lots of reports there to dig in on if you're interested, and give you ideas about this landscape that you have the I think incredible pleasure as someone who lives in LA, the pleasure of living in this climate, this history, this diversity, and the past as it was inhabited here for thousands and thousands of years before it was urbanized by Europeans. So thank you so much for that, and we'll take questions, I think.
Dr. Longcourt, thank you so much. This really set the tone quite well for the local concerns or opportunities, I think, that are there. You know, I think it's important to always balance the global with the local, and the fact that we're getting more and more city dwellers. I think, Dr. Chen, you mentioned the projections are up to 68% of people will be living within cities going forward. I think it's really important that we understand the balance and how to accommodate the new folks that will be populating our cities going forward. So there were a few things that were said, many things that were said that struck me, but Dr. Chen, you had mentioned that up to 1 in 4 lives could be saved through more thoughtful tree canopy, especially in underserved communities. But I think that's something that really struck me. I never directly associated trees and saving lives, but I think in how they function within the ecosystem, that's really an important point. And you also mentioned about the carbon storage. So I'm wondering right now, much of our carbon storage from these presentations are happening in our parkways with our street trees, and perhaps in our lower density and single family neighborhoods. So given the pressures on, challenges with new housing and new development, we have certain state mandates that the city has to accommodate. How do we start addressing that carbon storage component? Because are there alternative methods other than trees, for example, to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rick. And definitely when we think about, climate change, greenhouse gas, emission reduction and carbon storage, there are different ways, right, to address it. And, for trees, it could be part of the solution, but, of course, it couldn't solve all the problem we have. And especially when we look at the cities, right, when we look at new development, first of all, there are different ways, right? When we talk about the building itself, right? What kind of material and how do you design your building? That could make a big difference, right? And also it's the residents who live within the building, right? What is their lifestyle, right? And it's air conditioning, that's one example, right? And others, when it comes to the nature part, and first of all, yeah, not just trees, other plants, right? When you have more green space, right? It provides a cooling effect, which save energy, and indirectly it will reduce the greenhouse gas, emission. And directly, yes, the carbon sequestration itself, right? And carbon is just one benefit, right? That can provide their other co-benefits too. And also not just look at trees and soil, as I mentioned in my presentation. Soil is a big sink when it comes to carbon sequestration, and especially compared to vegetation and others. And so, but it happens very often, in cities, our soil are very compacted, and are not as functioning as the nature soil. So how can we make sure, for example, reduce the impervious surfaces, increase the pervious surfaces, right? And also to restore the soil health, right? Not just for carbon, and also to better support our vegetation, right? Trees and other plants. And I guess the whole idea is to create a mode, a nature environment, right? To mimic the nature and to plan and design intentionally, and also to maintain them intentionally too. For example, when it comes to water use, right? And when you plant different tree species, when you plant different plants, and they're going to have different water needs, right? And some of them are more drought tolerant, some of them are less, and some of them, doesn't need lots of maintenance, and some of them have a very high demand of maintenance. I think those are the factors, are the things you want to think about, right? When you do the species selection, right? When you do the design and when you do the maintaining. And also the other thing, we want not just look at, the environment we have now, we have to look ahead, right? First of all, what kind of climate we are going to have in the future, and how can we be proactively design and planning the environment we have in the city, and think about all the conflicts, right? How can we be creatively, to solve those conflicts, to integrate the gray, green, blue, and brown, right? Think it in a holistic way. And also, again, think about city as an ecosystem, right? When you have different components, how can you make them to more multi-beneficial and multifunctional, right? In this way, it will reduce the investment, maintenance, time, and to get, all the benefits, you need. And yeah, I think there are different ways, and also not just from the management, itself, and also the policy part too, right? How can we have like sound policies and sometimes with incentives, right? And also to engage everyone. We saw lots of participants today here, right? And you could be part of the solution, right? What do you do every day? And that's going to make a big difference, right? Because when we think about either the city of West Hollywood as a whole, or think globally, each one of us, we're all part of this big system. Everything we do every day, I think that's going to have an impact. I don't know if that answers your question, Rick.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the point is well taken that, it's really easy to point to the municipal government and say, what are you doing about this? But I think in effect, it's the collective, it's the individuals all working together incrementally that's going to make a difference, from the private little garden or backyard to other things that the city can do in terms of promoting more green space and healthy ecosystems. So I want to build off of one of our viewers' questions for both of you. They were asking, in West Hollywood, we're seeing a lot of move towards green walls and vegetative roofs in lieu of tree planting in native soil. Is that something that's a positive direction, or a replacement for trees that are planted in native soil, or is it a balance that's really important? Maybe Travis, you start with that, and then.
Sure. So, and this was sort of also relates to the previous question about sequestration. Is you got to think sequestration maybe isn't the most important part of the carbon benefits of trees. It's the shade and the cooling. But then it's not the only one, because you've got stormwater runoff and sort of the infrastructure that's associated with that, and the need to get water into the soil and have a healthy soil. So I think there's no substitute for having vegetation that is actually in the earth, that is connected to the whole system. But in the absence of that, it doesn't have to be either or, it has to be and also. When if you've decided that you have to have a certain amount of building area, a vegetated roof, and I prefer vegetated because sometimes, green has gotten this generic description of anything that is environmental. And there's a number, you could have a highly reflective roof and refer to that as being green, but vegetated roofs, they do serve that cooling function. They can serve important biodiversity functions if done appropriate to the ecology of the area. And that's one of the places where I think we can, actually there's a lot of additional work we can do here in Southern California to push that along. But the answer to that one is, it's why not both? One as far as you can, but then adding these features, because there's also the psychological benefits that we know of having a landscape that creates what gets described in the psychological literature as soft fascination, things that are the complexity of nature that draws your attention without burdening your mind. And the thing is, green walls and green roofs or vegetated roofs, looking at these things increases the psychological health of the environment. But as I said, not a substitute, but for when you get to the limits of one strategy, let's use the other strategy too.
Dr. Chen, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think Travis answered really well. Just something to add. Yeah, I guess, there's no one size fits all solution when we think about, nature-based solution. And also it all depends on the site, the condition you have, and also the needs, right? And for example, the site, maybe you have open space, could plant lots of trees. Maybe you have you don't have open space, you have to go vertically. If we couldn't go horizontally, you might have to go vertically. And also, it all depends on the site. And even for the buildings, as you know, not every building is suitable when it comes to green roof or green wall, right? So definitely you want to do the site assessment, even including the building assessment, right? And to look at the site you have, and also think about the needs, right? Like Travis said, there are lots of co-benefits, and each solution, they have different things they can offer, right? And are you more interested in to increase tree canopy? Are you more interested in increasing like a green space as a whole, or are you more interested in to how biodiversity or shade or carbon or other things? The other thing to think about is cost, right? Because as we all know, when it comes to green roof and green wall, sometimes it could be costly, and also the maintenance too. Because when we adopt anything, we want to think about the long-term maintenance, right? And again, this links to the first thing I said, the site assessment, because it all depends on the site you have, the capacity, the resources you have, right? And because there are different solutions and the needs. And so I would say it's really hard to say, it's like, okay, which one is better than the other one? It all depends on the site, the condition you have, the needs, and also the resources, right? And what do you want to achieve, right? And because overall, you want to use like the most like cost effectively approach, and also, to provide all the benefits you need. But again, yeah, there's no like one size fits all solution.
Sure, sure.
Mm-hmm.
I want to build off a little bit on the soil component, because we focus a lot on the benefits of the trees. And I think in your talk, you mentioned that 25% of biodiversity actually occurs within the soil itself. And in West Hollywood, because we are basically a built out city, there is no more land. And we're doing big efforts to expand green space and enhance our parks that we do have, and perhaps encourage pocket parks or other creative ways of adding. What we're seeing with new development, in part because of other goals, and everything is a balance, but we're seeing what I'm calling bathtub buildings, where new development is proposing designs that go right to the property line with underground parking, and then a slab on top, and then build up from there. And so the green space ends up in deeper planters on slabs, basically, but without that native soil component that perhaps was on site originally. So that leaves basically just our parkways and our parks as our sole provider on the native soil side of contributing to the ecosystem. And so if that trend were to continue, is that problematic, or because of our parks and parkways, is that sustainable?
That's a really good question. When we think about soil, and first of all, because it's underneath, it doesn't get like noticed or recognized when it comes to urban planning, or when it comes to sustainability legislation. But it has a lot to offer. Biodiversity, that's just one benefit. At the same time, in cities, what we see very often, not just here, and globally, we see very often, first of all, we have very limited space, right? We have very limited space. We have land use conflict because we have very high percentage of impervious surfaces, including buildings, roads, and others like paved surfaces. That means, first of all, when it comes to, the natural resources, especially the soil, resources, we have very limited resources. And also the quality, as you just said, it happens very often. It's not that favorable when it comes to tree planting, when it comes to vegetation, water infiltration, and other things. So there are a lot of things need to be done. First of all, you want to protect what you already have, because if you have good land, if you have good soil, you want to protect what you already have, because once it got degraded or contaminated or disturbed, it will take really long time. You need to invest lots of money, resources, either to clean up or to rehabilitate or to restore. So the first step, like trees, you want to protect what you already have, especially if those lands and soil are good, And secondly, of course, that's the ideal situation. Sometimes you do have cases that's not the case. But if that's not the case, you want to use some best management practices and to minimize the disturbance and maximize, the protection, and also, the ways you could do. For example, when you have the new, development, you can build fences, right, for certain area to protect those sites, and all reduce it heavy machinery. That's another way, right? And because the compaction, that's another thing. And also, I guess, just as time goes on, even after you design the landscape, right? Think about the soil, because after construction, sometimes you don't have a very good soil. What are the ways you could help, those degraded soil to restart, right? To rebuild, to rehabilitate, to restore, right? For example, it depends on the site again. It could be, maybe you use mulch, on the surface, or add a compost, or do some tilling, and the extreme case, sometimes you would need to replace your soil, which is not something we want to see, because it's not sustainable, and also it's really expensive. But I think overall, you want to do it intentionally and also proactively and strategically. First of all, you want to protect what you already have, and also use best management practices and develop some policy, right? And what are the things you could do, or you should limit the activities you can do, right? Things like that. And also to think about all the connection, right? Again, with below ground, the interface, the surface, and the background. For example, even you have the parking lot or other, it's a place. When you use permeable surface, which is different, right? You could make a big difference, not just for soil and for water too, right? And how can you design and plan intentionally at the same time to think about what are the impact to the soil, what soil can offer, right? And also the education, that's another piece too, right? So, how can we raise awareness about the importance of soil, and also to develop some, policy and best management practices, and to, either to protect, to restore, or to sustain, the lands and the soil we have.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I do want to point out for those listening in, is that the city of West Hollywood has always been very forward-thinking and thoughtful about the environment. And we do have an adopted climate action and adaptation plan, which goes beyond just greenhouse gas emissions, but looks at other things we can do within, the biodiversity setting. We've adopted an urban forest management plan, which oversees all our street trees and our park spaces, all our public trees, and a very vibrant program on that end, led by our facilities and rec services staff. We also have gone beyond the CalGreen requirements and adopted sustainable roof measures, getting back to the previous question, where developments of any substance are now required to do either vegetative roofs or solar collection or some other type of environmental benefit at the rooftops. And even embedded in our code, we have permeability requirements in new development in our residential areas, at least. And our council has directed us to look further into our tree canopy and expanding green space. So there will be more conversations in the community to come, hopefully very soon, to continue to build on that legacy, which I think is really strong and really admirable. And you mentioned education. One of our viewers asked about that. I'm dating myself. I recall as a kid growing up, seeing Woodsy the Owl and a lot of focus on ecology way back when. And I'm curious, it's not as, in the forefront these days. And where is this education happening in both of your experiences, for our next generations? Where are we talking about ecology these days?
Well, that's a really great question, because I've observed in the last 15 years that we've replaced education and discussion about sort of all the broad facets of environment, often with simply talking about climate. And this has happened in sort of the public sphere. I don't teach K-12, so I don't know what's going on there, but my guess is so much is being framed in the context of climate that sort of ecology and connection to place has taken a real backseat. And I think when this happened politically, which was sort of at Obama's first campaign, when he was the first presidential candidate nationally on the Democratic ticket side, at least, to not have a section of his website that was about parks, open space, conservation, but rather a section that was climate and environment. And so I think because of the and this is not to discount the importance of climate, but because of the primacy that it's gotten in this discussion, it's sort of become substituted in many of our activities and discussions for ecology and broader environmental issues. And it's pernicious in a number of different ways that I could go into if we had a lot more time. But suffice to say, I think there's a lot of room to learn, especially at earlier ages, to get that connection to place and other species and ecological processes, and know that, you know, you can see a barn owl in the city of West Hollywood, or know that the yellow rump warblers are going to show up at a certain time each winter to come and winter here, or that the orioles might come in the summer to nest at a certain time. These are things that can connect people to place in an important way that isn't abstract and about the whole world, and frankly, it can overwhelming, especially I think at earlier grade levels, about the whole world. But really connect to place and understanding that leads to a ethic and understanding of conservation more broadly. And this is one of the things that we at LA Audubon have done through development of schoolyard habitats, native habitats in schoolyards. And so, and even have, you have the kids in fourth grade knowing when there's a new bird on the school campus. And that doesn't have to be a thing of the past. It just means we have to commit to continuing to care about the traditional issues of air pollution, water pollution, biodiversity, and then adding, importantly, a justice to this and access to nature, so that we focus on these and have an opportunity to focus on them, and don't forget the places we live in, our connections to nature and our psychological health, while we're worrying about the planet as a whole.
And on that note of kind of learning and understanding the local ecosystem, you mentioned in your talk about indigenous culture and the burning of the bush and the harvesting of the chia seeds and other things. And we have a question for Dr. Chen. Is Tree People collaborating with LA's indigenous communities on some of its soil restoration and biodiversity efforts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. Before answering that question, I just want to add maybe a couple points about the education part. Yeah, I totally agree with what Travis said. It's really important, and also especially during this pandemic, and we have seen the increase in appreciation about nature, especially for people who live in cities. And when we think about our young generation, they are going to be the leaders in the future, right, to address all the problems, like including climate change. So, like, how can we provide opportunities, information, and resources and tools for them, from like the very beginning, right? And that's one thing actually Tree People is doing. We work with many schools and teachers and students across our county, and to do like tour, training, workshops, and project, and many other things. And also, the higher education too, like at the USA, I have my colleague Esther here who can speak a little bit more. We have the landscape architect, program there, and you see it's like lots of young talents, right? And So, how can we make sure, we have like the DOBAS program like that, right? For it's like many others, like to train, and also they're going to be like, the force, right? And to solve the problem in the future. I think like both it's like informal and formal education, both like higher education and also at the early, age. To address another question, so currently for the soil work, I just shared the link for the Healthy Soil for Healthy Community initiative. We just finished the phase 1, which is the needs assessment, and we looked at the soil in LA County. And first of all, in phase 1, we answered 3 questions. What do we have? What do we need? How can we get what we need? And so, not surprisingly, first of all, when we look at LA soil, for LA County, we have about 44% bare soil. That means we have lots of opportunity when it comes to soil management, soil restoration. And also, we also, based on, the soil survey, USDA and RCS did, and we have highly modified soil, not surprisingly, in LA. And when, for example, when we look at LA City, we have very high impervious surfaces, almost like 50%. So when we, did the needs assessment with online survey and the focus group, and the top need, first of all, we need to develop an overall strategy. And secondly, we need do more soil testing, especially community accessible soil testing. And also we need to address soil contamination. And we all need to work together, this is related to community engagement, public education, and also, partnership. And so for the indigenous, community, that's definitely something we want to explore in the next phase, to learn more about, their experience, right? And also to see if there's anything we can work together. I mean, not just in the city, in peri-urban area too, right? When we think about wildland urban interface, especially this is related to fire as well, right? And we do a lot of, mountain restoration work, especially now we have Tree People Land Trust, and we do have land in Santa Monica Mountain, which is one thing we have been doing. So yeah, that's definitely one thing we want to explore and to see like where we could, collaborate, right? First of all, to learn from them, at the same time, to work with them, and because this is really important, and not just for indigenous, community and other, community too, because in LA we have such a diverse, community here. First of all, how can we get their input, right, when it comes to not just soil management, urban forestry management and other, natural resource management too, and also to learn from them, especially, a lot of them have lots of experience to share, right, and moving forward, because, we all need to work together, right, to address the issue collaboratively. So yeah, I'm glad we got that question, so thank you.
All right, well, we have one last question, then we'll be taking a break. And the question from one of our listeners is that we're seeing oftentimes a loss of trees with new development, and certainly tree replacement policies are one avenue, but would it be possible to establish a green fund or an urban forest fund, not unlike the city's Affordable House Trust Fund? I know we have Quimby fees, which developers pay, but have you seen other jurisdictions that have established any sort of funds for lost tree canopy? Either of you?
I mean, you do see in lieu fees, but often it's just in place of there being paying for replacements, and this is actually a real challenge. And going back to something that we discussed earlier, which is, and really was the gist of the work that we did in the decade of the first decade of the 2000s, which is even in it, when you have a whole lot of tree planting, that was the era of million trees, tree planting effort in Los Angeles, we still had this dramatic decrease in urban forest canopy. And in historical context, we increased in canopy, at least in terms of stems, from like the 30s to the 90s, basically. The 1930s to the 1990s. And my colleague Tom Gillespie at UCLA did that work. And now we're going the other direction. And so that really illustrates you have to protect what you have, because, and you think about what trees mean here already, and I think, you know, I'm dodging the question a little bit because I don't have a great answer to it, but, you know, the trees in Los Angeles represent a decades and decades of investment of water that was imported from outside the watershed. And that's a significant choice that we've made to provide an amenity in this human habitat that we've created. And if you allow them to be lost, and you have even 3, 4, 5, you know, saplings put in their place, you've lost that huge investment of decades of a precious resource that is not going to get any more abundant. And so doing no harm first, I would say, and if we look to other sectors, providing incentives for people to not do that harm. And there's, you can look at that from the sort of pay people to do the right thing kind of approach. But the other thing you can do, and as long as Sacramento doesn't usurp all land use planning from the cities, is put in place zoning and development standards that actually require people to balance the needs of the community with their property rights, allows them reasonable development of their property without the ability, without the right to completely cover every square foot of their property with a structure, and to cut down whatever trees might be there. And places do this, and we did a study back a bit looking at the policies that lead to increasing tree cover in municipalities in the LA basin. And there are some things that you can't change at this point in time, but you can prevent in the future, like parcel size. The smaller you allow your parcels to get chopped up, the more trees you lose, or the less space there is for people to plant trees ultimately, because these go back, you know, decades and decades. But another one of them is having a ordinance that protects more than just native trees, a heritage tree ordinance, something that gives there to be at least a disincentive to people to take that investment of water taken from Northern California and supporting a tree for 60 years and just throwing that out the river, out the window, right? And even it doesn't have to be a whole lot, but the number of trees protected by a protected tree ordinance correlates with the urban tree canopy. Being a Tree City USA and saying we're great about trees had zero correlation with the amount of tree cover. Okay, it's actually having policies that protect trees is what gives you a greater tree cover, at least in Los Angeles as of 2000 and whatever it was we did this, 9, 8, 7, something.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
I think we can pick up on this theme later in the program, because I guess this is something that I'd like to bring in our final 2 speakers on as well. And just looking at time, I want to keep us on track as well. And I would clarify that we, you know, our public spaces, our street trees, our parks, we do have very good protection policies in place. And we also in West Hollywood have a heritage tree program that if individuals want to learn more about, we can talk further about that as well. But I do want to thank both Dr. Chen and Dr. Longcore. This is a great conversation, and we'll be inviting you back after our other 2 speakers, and I think we can pick up on even more of these themes. So for everybody, we'll be taking a 7-8 minute break. We'll be starting again at 10:40, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
thank you.
I believe we have some slides telling a little bit more about some of the city programs and opportunities to get involved for those that are interested during the break. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We touched briefly in the opening session on some of the efforts the City of West Hollywood has already made towards advancing biodiversity and more climate responsive designs and developments. So what's scrolling right now are a series of efforts that have been undertaken by different divisions and departments within the city. Our city staff has really worked hard to develop a number of these plans and programs. And if you're interested in more information, at the bottom of the slide, you're welcome to follow up to get more information. There's a lot brewing. So with that, we'll be moving on to the second segment of our symposium today. Again, it will be 2 speakers, and in a similar fashion, please feel free to give us your thoughts and any questions you may have. And we've started by looking at the ecosystem as a whole and the role of trees and soil and water in our ecosystem. And now we're going to move more to a focus on wildlife habitats and some of the work that's being done at the Natural History Museum to chronicle and document the diversity of the species in the Southern California region. And joining us is Dr. Brian V. Brown. Dr. Brown heads the LA County Natural History Museum's entomology department and is a curator of entomology. Dr. Brown received both his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Guelph in Ontario, and then earned his doctorate at the University of Alberta. Dr. Brown's research centers on the systematics, evolution, and natural history of phorid flies, especially the species known as ant decapitating flies and bee killing flies. He has been a recipient of multiple National Science Foundation research grants, and at the Natural History Museum has led the creation of the BioScan project that we're going to hear a little bit about today. This project is the world's largest urban biodiversity study, and it takes an in-depth look particularly at insect biodiversity in the Los Angeles region. We are very privileged to have us join us today and look at how urban density fits into our natural ecosystem through the lens of wildlife in particular. So welcome and thank you for joining us, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Rick. Let me see. We good? Yeah?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, good. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this symposium. It's really interesting. And I commend my 2 predecessors, Travis Loncourt and Dr. Yuzhuan Chen. So I'm the curator of entomology at the Natural History Museum, where we have about 6 million specimens of insects of all types from all over the world, including these beautiful giant beetles from tropical rainforests. And indeed, until recently, this is where you would find me doing my research in South and Central America, places where new discoveries are just guaranteed. It seems like the possibilities for exciting new discoveries are endless. But a few years ago, I started thinking, what would happen if we looked at the city in the same way we looked at tropical rainforests? Would we find anything interesting? Would there be new species to discover? Would it even be worth doing? And the reason I had to ask those questions was because urban biodiversity was a very new subject back then, at least to me, and it still is fairly underdeveloped. We thought, most entomologists think of city fauna as being something similar to rats and cockroaches, sparrows, and things that are associated with humans and their filth, but we really didn't know. So before I talk about urban biodiversity, I should mention a little bit about biodiversity in general. It's already been discussed quite a bit, but Biodiversity can be summarized as the sum of all species of plants and animals and their interactions in the environment. It varies across the globe from high levels in tropical rainforests and tropical coral reefs and lower levels at the poles and in the driest parts of the world. It also tends to be lower in places that humans interact with us. So human activities, introductions of other species tends to lower species diversity in sites. And the study of biodiversity and its applied arm, conservation biology, incorporates values into science. Like, people think about science as being very precise and logical, but biodiversity studies and conservation biology involve values, us making choices. Is this a good species or a bad species? Is more biodiversity good or not? And of course, we have to have biodiversity. It's necessary for all functioning ecosystems. It provides us with the clean air, water, medicine, food, everything that we need for life. So Travis talked about this a lot more thoroughly than I can. Hollywood used to look a lot different than it does now. We can see that the habitat in the 1920s was very different. This was my guess at what the lowlands was like. Travis had some reconstructions as well. You can see that it's very dry, not a lot of biomass on the soil. This has been replaced just about everywhere in the LA basin by this kind of environment. Much greener, huge trees everywhere. And this is because of all the water, of course, we've brought in, as has been discussed. Some of my neighbors have taken this even farther. They try to grow rainforests in their yards, just cramming in all these species from all over the world and horrific amounts of water. So obviously in that last rainforest-like site, we were going to have different biodiversity than we did back in the 1920s in Hollywood. So what is here now? That's the question. So I started looking in backyards, including my own, and I started finding crazy things from Africa, things from Europe, things that we didn't expect. And this was looking at phorid flies. As Rick already said, this is the group I work on. They're small, 1 to 3 millimeter long insects that do all kinds of things, including the ant decapitating flies that he already mentioned. Now, I can't see your faces, but I know a lot of people are probably thinking right now, what's he talking about? Flies? I don't want flies in my backyard. Why would you study flies anyway? And of course, flies are really important organisms to all of us, both for the bad reasons. They're vectors of disease, such as malaria carrying mosquitoes. They're agricultural pests like the medfly that we still spend a lot of money controlling. And they also have all the nuisance effects that we spend a lot of money on as well. They also do a lot of good things. They provide us with ecosystem services like decomposition. Just think about all the plant and animal waste that's decomposed by fly larvae or maggots in our environment. Billions of dollars a year in ecosystem service value. And there's pollinators, predators, and parasitoids. And if that doesn't move you, think about having flycatchers, like vermilion flycatchers. We need flies to have other animals around us. They support local wildlife. They eat things and they are eaten by other things. So flies are super important. Okay, so you have to work on insects, but why not bees? Aren't bees more important because they're pollinators? Or butterflies? Everybody loves butterflies. Why don't you work on them? So we do work on these other groups as well. But there's a problem with working on just bees and butterflies, and that is that they're kind of one-dimensional. So bees feed on pollen and nectar, and that's how they interact with the environment. They're pollinators. They're associated with plants. Butterflies, their larvae feed on plants. But phorid flies, on the other hand, do just about everything a group of insects can do. They're predators, parasitoids, scavengers, fungus feeders, plant feeders. Some are aquatic. They just do all kinds of things. So when we study phorid flies, we're not just studying these 1 to 3 millimeter long little invisible creatures. We're studying all their effects and all their interactions with the environment. There's also a lot of different kinds of phorid flies. There's about 120 species that we found in the Los Angeles area. And amazingly, half of these were unknown to science before we started our work. Remember, I was asking myself, would it be worth studying in the city? It turns out that there was all kinds of unknown things here for us to discover. The way we study these flies is we use tent-like traps called malaise traps. Insects fly into them. They make their way, they're not baited, so there's no attractants or anything. They make their way up to the top where there's a collecting bottle with alcohol. In order to put these traps out across the city, we partnered up with local landowners or homeowners. We call them site hosts, who agree to host these traps for a year at a time. And you can see this is one of our site hosts, Eric Keller, with a trap and a weather station behind it. The weather station was necessary for the climatic variables that we wanted to analyze. We've done this across the city in about 80 sites so far. These are the ones closest to the center of the city in the area we're talking about today. And of these sites, our best site, the most species, was Glendale, this site. You can see when you look from above why this site was the best. It's basically in the natural habitat. It's right in the national forest, basically. And you can see that it's an oak forest. There's some chaparral on the hillside nearby. There's dead grass around. There's no irrigation. Compare that with our least successful site. This is just west of the museum. This is a site that's intensely suburbanized and cut up into small land parcels. You can see that there's grass here. So there's irrigation taking place. There's a few scruffy bushes. There's a hot tub, not much habitat here. So based on these collections and about 200,000 specimens that we've looked at, we've come up with a backyard biodiversity index. It's kind of a number grade we give to the sites based on the diversity and the evenness of the phorid fly fauna. So our most successful site was up here. Again, that's Glendale, 93%. Our least successful site was down here. It was 46% we gave it. And then there's a whole bunch of other sites that have the yellow grade. These are sites that are often close to other sites with different colored dots. This tells us that there's something to be looking at here, that closely located sites have different attributes that we can study. One site that got kind of a disappointing orange is the museum down here, especially compared to the yellow site above. And I know that those percentages don't look like they're too different, but again, this is based on 200,000 specimens we've looked at. So this really is a significant difference in our opinion. So the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County has a nature garden out front. This is a 3.5 acre development here, which was put together as a showcase for native biodiversity. And you can see that it's not in a chopped up environment like the worst site was. It's beautiful. It's everybody's ideal of what a backyard habitat could be if you had enough space and enough money. There's beautiful wildflower meadows there. It's just looking perfect. But according to the phorid flies and other groups of insects, it's not, there's something wrong here, especially compared to this other site just to the north of it. So what's going on? This site is closer to the city center. It looks like it's more like the chopped up worst site in terms of the physical characteristics. Well, when we looked at these groups of sites and their differing grades, we found that there was one thing in common amongst all the yellow dot sites. They use less water and they have more drought tolerant plantings. This was a pervasive pattern across the LA region, that you could increase your biodiversity by using less water. Now this is for phorid flies and some other groups of flies. When we looked at bees, it was the absolute opposite. The museum garden was the best spot for bee collections, and it was the worst, Glendale was the worst spot. And I'm not talking about honeybees. Honeybees are attracted to just about any kind of flower that you want to put out. That's why we use them for agriculture. They're an introduced species that it's great for pollinating plants for food. But we have all these native bees. These are the ones that we want to promote. We have longhorn bees. We have green bees. We have blue bees. We have plain peekaboo bees. We have bumblebees. We have leafcutter bees. Leafcutter bees are cool because we can put out blocks of wood and drill holes in it, and those bees will use it as nesting sites for years and years. So the moral of this is that we can increase the bee diversity of a site by planting flower gardens. We can do the same for butterflies as well. Travis is working on some butterflies as well that don't fit this pattern, I imagine, because they're very specialized. But if you plant something like a strip of lantana, which is a common horticultural plant in LA, you can quickly attract lots of butterflies, like this cloudless sulfur, morning cloak, monarch butterfly. So planting and attracting butterflies, at least of some species, is extremely easy to do. But we have to remember that flower gardens are habitats on steroids. They get pampering year-round with water, often fertilizer, and the recipients of these benefits, the butterflies and the bees, the benefits are not necessarily shared with the other insects that are found there, and the ecosystem services that they provide are not necessarily transferred. So my recommendation for insect gardening or for biodiversity in LA is kind of nuanced based on these results. First of all, reduce the watering. We need to embrace seasonal gardens that are not green all year round. Moving towards no summer water landscapes would be a real positive move, especially because water is the great evil that promotes Argentine ants. We all know what Argentine ants are. They're the small brown ants that come into our house every summer searching for water. And they form a living carpet over all of the irrigated area of Los Angeles. This living carpet of Argentine ants excludes all the native ants. So every time you put in a butterfly garden or a bee garden, you're keeping out the native ants. You may say, okay, that's fine. I care about bees. I don't care about ants, but some wildlife needs native ants. Again, this is part of the trade-offs that we have to think about when we think about conservation biology and the values that we have to discuss. Recommendation number 2 follows recommendation number 1. Lose the lawn. Lawns take up a huge amount of water. Over an inch of water a week for a lawn. And we can see the amount of overwatering that's taking place in the city when we see eruptions of mushrooms like this in gardens, in front yards. We can even see this in the phorid fly populations. When we look at the catch of the flies across the summer, we can see spikes in these mushroom-associated flies coming along. And this doesn't cause any direct damage, but it shows how out of balance our water use is when we have those sorts of effects happening. Then finally, keep the soil. One of the reasons why the museum's garden might be disappointing relative to the other one, just to the north of it, would be because 10 years ago, when we built that garden, we scraped off all the soil and took it down to concrete and clay. It could take decades for that soil to come back, as has already been mentioned. So the soil is important as well. Again, I want to emphasize that conservation biology and biodiversity are value-oriented sciences. They require opinions and discussion. How similar do you want the environment of West Hollywood to be to a natural environment? How would you know when you got there? You have to have some kind of indexing or some kind of monitoring to get there. Do we care about summer watering? Can we do this on a large enough scale to actually affect our local wildlife? That's a big question. Whatever we do to increase biodiversity in the area, though, is going to make West Hollywood a safer and healthier place for all of its inhabitants. And before I finish, I just want to put in a couple of plugs. Right now at the museum, there's an exhibit on insect photography, if you're interested in seeing it, called Spiky, Hairy, Shiny, The Insects of LA. And there's an article in this month's National Geographic about my work in the tropics, and it includes insect photographs as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. It was, that exhibit looks really interesting when you get up close. It's pretty fascinating, the richness of some of our insect life in the city. All right, well, we'll be moving on to another form of, another part of the animal kingdom, the humans, and how we build and construct within these ecosystems, and particularly maybe some of the lessons that we could learn from that, and hopefully with new development be in greater concert with opportunities going forward with tapping into nature. So joining us is Sean Quinn, AIA. Sean joins us from San Francisco, where he leads the sustainable design practice of HOK Architects Pacific Region. He is a graduate of Catholic University of America, where his Master of Science in Sustainable Design followed up on his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame, where our mayor also hails from. Although based in San Francisco, Sean coordinates the performance design services across the firm's Los Angeles, Seattle, and Asia Pacific regions. His primary focus is on his studio's integrated design approach, specifically guiding the application of sustainable strategies, including energy and environmental performance, resilience planning, and green building certifications. Sean drives sustainability efforts across all the project types at their firm, achieving significant environmental, health, and resilient enhancements while striving towards zero net energy solutions. Lastly, he is also co-founder and former chair of HOK's Impact, which is a group that seeks social, environmental, and economic benefits for the communities they serve. We appreciate you taking the time with us today, Sean, to explore how we can better extract lessons from nature in developing new design solutions for urbanized environments. Welcome, Sean.
Rick, thanks so much for having me. So I'm happy today to talk about some of the most exciting work going on at HOK. It's our focus on biomimicry. Hope everyone can see the screen from that, Rick?
Yes, I think we're good.
Excellent. And really this is about how do we design with nature? Really honored to be speaking with all the different members here today, and really the layering that you've seen about the notion of the importance of forests and cities, how that influences biodiversity. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the intersection that happens with the built environment, which almost inherently is built out of things that are more artificial. And the challenge that I think we have to try and address that a bit more creatively and a bit more naturalistically. So HOK is a global design, architecture, and engineering firm. We span the globe with 22 offices, and we work across everything from high-rise office buildings to CEDIA, healthcare projects, down to multifamily residential. And my role as a sustainable design leader across the firm is really to begin tackling some of those built environmental issues as it relates to sustainability or more hopefully, as we continue to talk about this, regeneratively. How do we start going beyond some of the more typical topics that we hear across California and around the world of net zero energy, enhancing health and well-being, net zero water, and reducing body carbon, to some of the topics that are related to everything that's been broached today? Improving air quality, not only indoors, but also outdoors, using healthy and regenerative materials, incorporating restorative and regenerative principles, and responding to the future impacts of climate change. All of these topical notes here are lifted off of requests for proposals that come to HOK and other architecture, engineering, and planning firms from governmental developers, private developers, as well as other institutional clients that we have. And it's really phenomenal starting to think about those later ones here and the challenge that that can really bring, because they're kind of put out there quite broadly. And so to address these issues, we talk through the lens of biodesign. And there are a number of different ways by which we can start talking about the integration of life into design. The sort of topical list here: bioclimatic design, biomorphic design, biophilic, biomimicry, biomaterials, biometrics. It's a little exhausting, can be very confusing. And so to give just a quick sample here, the image is across the bottom of the screen are different strands of E. coli that have been essentially percolated in a lab for creative artistic exploration. They don't perform or do anything. They just look quite lovely and really create a wonderful lens to thinking about the way bacteria grows. The image to the upper right, as beautiful as that one is really meant to help address advanced forms of cancer. And so in the incorporation of nature, we can
Let's see, Sean, it looks like you've frozen.
Can you all hear me still?
Yeah, you froze for a moment there. I think we're
okay. Hope we're back. So the way that we address that on a daily practice is through what we call bioclimatic design, more frequently termed as environmental design. So how do we incorporate the conditions of the environment? This refers to the design of buildings and spaces, interior, exterior, outdoor, based on the local climate. We're aimed at providing thermal and visual comfort, making use of solar energy and other environmental sources. The goal is to balance climate, culture, and aesthetics while incorporating program, budget, and code. We've been really proud to do this around the world and been recognized by the American Institute of Architects and the Committee on the Environment, sort of highest accolade you can have towards environmentally focused architecture over the past several years. And 3 of them that I've had the chance to work on are located in Hawaii, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia. Each of them requires a very specific mean by which to address the conditions of that place. Each of them have very different cultural circumstances, and they're also very different in terms of feel. Completely, subtropical, hot and humid, and fairly comfortable in Hawaii, where my job gets pretty easy. Biophilic design, it goes beyond the sort of essence of trying to mitigate the impacts that we have on nature and trying to incorporate these systems. It's really about how do we enhance the connections that people have with nature. What if we could experience the same psychological and emotional benefits through an urban landscape that we experience walking through a forest? How can we bring this concept of forest bathing that we want to have 2 to 4 hours of a week to enhance our own personal health and well-being and bring that indoors? We've seen that done through living green walls, but what if we also went beyond the elements of actually just bringing nature into buildings, but bringing some of the patterns and principles of it? Having filtered light that replicates the systematic means of a forest canopy, using natural resources to create screening. So there's a sense of discovery as you move through a building. Looking at low embodied carbon materials that also enhance personal comfort. So looking at an airport building here on the right, where we really try to bring comfort and wellness to someone who's traveling in a hectic, busy schedule. Especially in areas like this where people might now be traveling as we get towards the end of this pandemic, hopefully. And down towards science and laboratory environments where we can't bring in natural systems themselves. And so we try and emulate that through bringing up natural imagery. In this case, a laboratory environment where there's imagery throughout the space of local flora and fauna. We've blown them up, enlarged them, and actually encoded some of the DNA embedded throughout this imagery. And so you're sort of reminded of the mission focus that you have in that space. Every position of this floor plate has views out to different areas of the Bay region in San Francisco, where I'm based. And we've included topographical maps of that. And so you're constantly getting a little bit of a lens of the various means of very direct nature, as well as some of the synergies and sort of just patterns of nature. But biomimicry looks to go a step further beyond from that, incorporating both those climatic conditions and also the means of connecting to nature. But how do we actually emulate those natural systems that we find in nature and bring them all together to start giving a positive benefit, both to the urban environment, to people, and to the natural sphere that we are, blessed to live within. And that's by looking at some of the key performance indicators that nature gives us. That individual species are near each other and create a systematic means by which they regulate temperature, erosion control, nutrient cycling, and some with their own unique twists of how they begin to thrive in those environments. And so Janine Benyus, the founder of Biomimicry 3.8, really challenges us all to start thinking about how the forest and the city can be functionally indistinguishable. That's the only means by which we reach true sustainability. So HOK has been partnered with Biomimicry 3.8 for over a decade now. And one of the means by which we've tried to really work with them is to try and understand the biology around us. We do that begin by first looking at the genius of biomes that are around us. A biome goes beyond climatic conditions and starts incorporating the conditions that give a good balance to habitat. What creates the conditions for those flora and fauna and essentially the right habitat for life? So what can designers learn from the resiliency and adaptability of nature? The California coast is home to more than 8,000 plant species and several thousand animal species. And so through an analysis of champion species that adapted to challenges unique to California, a team of designers and biologists explore solutions for building facades, structures, water management, and dynamic landscape. And so we do this by learning to and adapting from the global biomes and then addressing the California coast, which isn't a broad-reaching biome around the world. The California coast is representative of what's called a series of ecotones. While we're generically described as Mediterranean, California actually spans 4 biomes: temperate steppes, Mediterranean vegetation, montane forests, and xeric shrubland. Those conditions of transition between those biomes can be miles, and they can also be feet. Along California's coast, especially along the coastal highway, you can span through 3 of these biomes in less than a 1-mile hike. And so there's a real ability to not only see the diversity of life, but to really experience it. We also have to deal with extreme challenges. Drought, earthquake, forest fires, and urban encroachment present extreme challenges for any species to thrive. Yet the tenacity of nature has been able to adapt to and thrive in the face of that adversity and change over generations. So how can we in the design community begin to create possible solutions for addressing climate change, urbanization, natural disaster, and even pandemic? And so the first one begins, to give an example of how this process works, I'll take you to the Bay Area where we've begun looking at some of those ecotone systems. And so when you come along the sort of the western edge of the Bay, you see a lot of tilt-up buildings where once there was a lush coastal redwood biome that met into an oak woodland biome. So there's a lot of effort now really trying to re-oak the Silicon Valley area. Most of our largest tech companies reside in tilt-up buildings that sort of, tore down those over generations in the mid 20th century. So how can we begin to look at and explore not only how to repopulate that landscape, but also how to create a better building architecture that lends itself better for that nature to thrive, but also for people. And so what happens obviously within ecotones is a series of different species begins to populate, and we can begin to take inspiration for that for design. The buttercup is well known for its specific characteristics for color and light distribution. As a performance designer, my goal is to enhance people's access to views and daylight while ensuring an energy efficient building. And so by looking at the buttercup, we begin seeing the principles of opening and closing over the course of the day, tracking the sun, adjusting itself to try and receive as much light as possible. But when we dig down into the epidermal layers of that buttercup, you see not only a direct light bounce, but a diffuse light bounce, as well as through the epidermal layer of a selection of the color waves coming through that multicolored light. And we begin to translate that through brainstorming. With the information from our biological partners, we begin to sort of experiment. What are the means by which we could incorporate some of those natural factors into built environment solutions? How do we test that through building simulation to look at the way glare currently comes into a space that has no form of shading, how creating a light shelf might allow deeper daylight bounce, but also brings heat and extreme light and glare deeper into that space. If we were able to diffuse that by looking at other more translucent materials, could we create a better balance deep inside? And what if we could even select for that color? Well, that last portion we're still working on, and this is where we want other partners by looking at chemical materials. The latter stage of trying to diffuse light, then it leads us to investigate means by which we can enable that light bounce in a variety of different ways through surface materials. So without better emulation, we have a space with a deep floor plate, 60 feet wide, that still has extreme dark environments. By looking at some of the layers of materials, its roughness, much by looking at nature, we begin to enable greater daylight into that space. We integrate that into the building. We try and modularize that for efficiency of cost. And we create a concept that is hopefully inspirational that can blend itself into reality. So Central and Wolf is now Apple's third headquarters building. We're happy to see that the natural landscape has been built out here, but there's a real synergy as you move up through this building, as you can relate to the forest canopy that extends beyond you. The integration of succulents into the green roof, the ability to look at a sort of transformational and sinuous urban forms creates a real extension of those sort of natural principles. We create central gathering spaces that are normally populated only for select times of day, but we've tried to sort of activate them for daytime, nighttime. Looking at another species, the coast live oak. The coast live oak is a wonderful ecosystem engineer. Its best design principle that we can learn from is that it is really a natural placemaker within the natural environment. So how can we extend that into the built environment? A coast live oak is tremendously aggressive in pursuing sunlight, and is actually extends its branches far and wide. Its root structure as a result as well balances itself by extending far and wide. And so a diversity of flora and fauna begin to filter into that. But what that does as a result as well, it balances the air temperature. It allows for evapotranspiration, the release of carbon dioxide, or sort of the release of oxygen and water into the air that maintains a closer air temperature point. So how can we translate that into some of the factors of a building by thinking about those same lenses, that the root structure becomes the place by which we enter into a building, the trunk moving up to the canopy that extends out, and look through the lens of Stanford's new Center for Academic Medicine, where we're placed against the Arboretum. We're looking at an urban infill project here, where we're building on top of an existing parking structure. So rather than building a building adjacent to the forest, how can we build a building within the forest? Well, that means bringing the forest into it. What if the park was what defined the campus and not the building spaces inside of it? And so we need to think in best response to environmental conditions. How do we enable passive solar and daylight into the space, canting the buildings to enable for natural ventilation, but actually reducing the amount of square footage on our ground floor so that we can create additional layers of green space? What if our building could have more green area when the project exists than if it was just the park itself? And those series of rules begin to enable us to really start structuring out a proper built environment, but also one that begins to create natural outdoor workplace. A unique condition that happens in West Hollywood and in this case Palo Alto, but around anywhere in the US, is that limitation of how much a developer can build on site. The program that this building had called for 20% more area than we were allowed to actually physically build. And so we looked to actually program workplace and mixed amenity areas inside and outside the building. 20% of the programmatic area of this building is outdoor workplace. That's in the form of circulating corridors, but also balcony areas that serve as conference rooms. And most importantly, at the Arboretum edge, bringing that Arboretum inside and creating a diversity of spaces that are balanced for wind and balanced for daylight, such that on any day when it's not raining, throughout the entire course of the year, you have a summer garden that's been well shaded and well ventilated, spring and fall gardens that in the morning are warm and alternative ones in the afternoon, and winter gardens that are exposed to an extreme amount of sunlight. We show these initially in renderings, but it's phenomenal now seeing the building finished in the past 2 weeks that those spaces are beginning to be occupied, and that ability to really excite that environment around the course of any given day. And that people begin to experience a real vitality of space through this. We've tried to take some of the plant species that I photographed in the Arboretum and lend that actually to the interior palette. And the same notion of actually looking at a tree itself. How can we begin to color code some of the internal spaces to match the Arboretum ground, coming up through the understory and the colors that brings through the canopy and the sky. The actual color palette of the entire experience inside that space goes from warm to cool. Going further afield around the world, and not the work of HOK, but of a wonderful partner firm that I've had the chance to work with over the years, WehoTV, we began looking at how the built environment might actually become more naturalistic than if it weren't there itself. And so looking at a city like Singapore, urban infill in 2000 led to new regulations to increase the amount of green aspect ratio within cities. So when this one mixed-use development was torn down around 2010, you're left with an option. Does this space become more like the park across the street? You can create more open lawns, which we've just learned that bring their own challenges. In the case of Singapore, we've got plenty of rain, so perhaps less an issue. But will we be able to actually incorporate more canopy? The solution that was actually implemented in Park Royal on Pickering by WehoTV architects actually featured more green area than if the building didn't exist at all. And I think this is a real inspiration point for architects and urban planners, interior designers as well. How does the built environment present the opportunity to actually create more naturalistic area than if the city did not exist? This is a hotel project, and so is any hospitality project. The goal is to try and create the sort of wonderful essence of Southeast Asia, where you would normally be traveling out to Bali or Indonesia, the Philippines, to take advantage of villas along the beach, and instead tries to bring that same existence and environment into the city. And so that aspect of forest bathing is obviously available to those people that are able to pay for this privately used space. But at the ground floor, there's a real public amenity to this as well. That the whole sort of thesis of the architecture is meant to sort of extrapolate those naturalistic and organic forms, but also natural systems. And so as you walk along the sidewalk, open and exposed to tree canopy, water flowing through with evapotranspiration, all recycled water, walking underneath the canopy during rainfall, or approaching this building from afar, you're seeing natural systems inside of that urban sphere, much more dynamically than in any other place we've seen in the world. And so achieving all of this always comes down to not just working on your own, but working through a great collaboration with partners. Biomimicry 3.8 has been a phenomenal guide for us to incorporate biology at the design table. I work with MIT's Sustainable Design Lab in the development of those building simulation tools that enable us to actually really test truly both those building performance factors for engineering systems, but also natural systems. And in working with the International Living Future Institute and their Living Building Challenge, begin to focus more on some of those biophilic patterns. How can we connect both people to nature, but at the end result, trying to emulate nature itself? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Really, really wonderful presentation. I heard a few things I haven't heard before, and I'm anxious to follow up as well. So if we could bring Brian Brown back in, and we have a few questions, and then we'll ask our first two speakers to join us as well for a final conversation after that. So let's see, Dr. Brown, are you with us here?
I'm here.
Okay, terrific. So Sean, maybe you can stop your screen share there.
You got it.
Okay, so
I have a question for Sean if there's time.
sure, why don't you start off? That's great.
Okay, I was just wondering, Sean, it's really cool, that development in Singapore. I wonder if biologists are involved in the design of those spaces, because I know that here, if we were putting in, gardens that are like balconies and so on, it would be really easy for those to be dominated by invasive species or non-native species. And so it wouldn't necessarily, it would help with the biophilic aspects of what you're talking about, but it wouldn't help with the native biodiversity.
Well, I think so. I can't speak as precisely to it, having not worked on that building myself. It's the work of a firm called WehoTV, which really specializes in both the built form, but also a really phenomenal landscape design team within. So it is using all local landscape species to Singapore. Most of the sort of planters on the outside edge of the building are over a meter deep of soil. So there's tremendous structural engineering that goes along with it. But it does actually enable a lot of the same sort of species growth, and that you will actually have birds nesting in many of those trees. You find a lot of the same insects and pests that maybe you don't want in a hotel room. And that's normally done by some level of separation that you find between some of the more dynamic landscapes. And then on some of the more sort of public amenity floors, you find those species that are a little bit more, what can I say, calmly tamed. And so some of them, I think, to your point, don't enable the same level of biodiversity, but those areas that are more isolated, they do. I think that's sort of it's the careful selection that needs to go on here to make sure that you can create a diverse landscape, but also one that you can maintain.
Yeah, that's such an important point that, as we bring the built environment, the natural environment together at that point of intersection, there's potential for positive impacts and negative. And I'm, sure with new development, in most cases, at least in West Hollywood, we have a landscape architect on board, and as part of their education, I would think the sort of biological component and ecological component are part of their decision making. But it would be interesting to see if we can do some sort of post-occupancy analyses on projects that are successful in integrating heavily new opportunities for flora and fauna, how successful they are, or are those, invasive species, both on the plant and wildlife side.
I've one wonderful sort of anecdote on that one, which is going back a few years, worked on NOAA's Center for Weather and Climate Prediction in Maryland. And it's unfortunately around the time when, a little bit after 2008, when the building had finished its exterior shell, the developer unfortunately went bankrupt. And so development stopped. The green roofs had already been installed. And so when a new developer picked up the project 2 years later, we noticed that there was corn growing on the green roof, which we obviously had not planted ourselves. So it was really the notion that some local birds had brought seeds and spread that through. And so there is a real great way. We haven't done as much, but a couple of partner firms have actually really sort of invested in both, meters and sensors, and gone back and sort of visited what species are naturally forming through the integration of birds and other fauna onto projects.
Yeah, we actually have a building right when Holloway intersects with Sunset Boulevard that has put in an extensive green wall, planted green screen element. And it would be fascinating to kind of do a little analysis there of how it's attracted and changed perhaps that particular setting. But we have seen those strategies tried in the past. One thing, Dr. Brown, you mentioned in your talk, which I thought were really essential to highlight was the importance of values in a community. And, you know, West Hollywood has a very strong sense of core values that celebrate all forms of diversity and, you know, move towards quality of life issues and public safety and equity, inclusion, et cetera. But it's also a community that's very interested in providing housing opportunities for more people and promoting economic development, both of which involve new construction in many cases. Of course, the most sustainable thing we can do is to reuse the buildings we have and repurpose them and restore them. But when not possible, certainly new construction is part of the equation. And so in developing those core values, how do you suggest that the kind of ecological aspects of planning a future community come in? You know, we're in the process of doing our housing element right now. Our general plan certainly has an open space and green space element, but I haven't heard a lot from the biology and ecology sector. Is that something that the Natural History Museum often gets involved in terms of local planning?
No, we're a bunch of ivory tower academics, actually. But, you know, that doesn't exclude the possibility of doing so.
Mhm.
I think we have to recognize, first of all, that we're not going back to some mythical past. We can't go back to those landscapes that used to be there. Those are gone for good. And people want trees. I mean, it's been obvious today that even if they don't, you know, biologically belong there, people want trees for reasons other than biodiversity. They want them for shading, for biophilic purposes, and so on. So I think that the reasonable value to hold is that we should use trees as much as possible that reflect the nearest natural area, which is the oak forest, the oak woodland, as Travis pointed out in his talk. So if I was doing this, if I was the mayor pro tem or someone with even more power, I would say that we should make West Hollywood the world's largest urban oak woodland as a goal, and use that as a value, a guiding value.
Interesting. I was also struck by one image that you showed of a parkway strip, and you're talking about the lantana and the role of that type of planting in attracting, you know, butterflies or what have you. It's not something we've seen a lot in the parkways, but is that something that you find is useful to think about our parkways as attractors?
Sure. I mean, parkways, commercial areas that are currently planted with basically exotic and inert biologically plant material, replace them with local oak woodland species like buckwheats and various other mallows, things that would attract native wildlife, and not, you know, again, trying to get the native bees promoted, not the honeybees. I see that, I get that a lot with bee gardens. People want to plant plants that attract bees, but again, we want to promote the native species.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, there's all kinds of opportunity when we look at some of these commercial spaces, and I wouldn't say throwaway spaces, but spaces that aren't usually thought of as habitat, to get some more native species in there.
Yeah. Sean, one of the things that you touched upon in the, I think it was the Stanford project, was the elevated ground plane. And I find that really interesting, that if for other goals of the city, we're going to be going taller, perhaps, are there opportunities at the ground level that we look at to perhaps reduce the use of the ground floor for you know, internal occupiable space, and maybe use that concept you were talking about of a percentage of the program for the project being accommodated outdoors, you know, the outdoor meeting rooms or the outdoor
Yeah.
gathering spaces, is there potential at the ground floor in particular where it's the easiest place to kind of integrate some of these ecosystem goals?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, the driving factor that sort of led to so much exterior space was some of those limitations of area, but it had always been a bit of the intent of the project as well to be welcoming to the public, which isn't always the case for major universities, especially a lot of technology companies in the Bay Area, in Los Angeles, and other parts of the US. And so I think the first thing is that we're by creating a ground area that's more eroded, we enable more people to kind of come through and experience that space. And that really excites most landscape designers as well as architects to make sure that there's a bit more of a programmatic sort of function to it. And so you can be left with some of the more, let's call them, broad open public squares that we've seen in more of the mid 20th century. But I think the notion here of sort of inviting the park into the building was really the driving factor here. So how can we appropriately bring natural spaces to define areas that can be occupied, interacted with, as well as those areas that we want to enable the sort of migration of biodiversity across that site.
Okay. Dr. Brown, I had another question for you that I thought we wouldn't want to gloss over necessarily. When you were talking about some of your recommendations, I think the reduction in water usage is I don't say it's counterintuitive, because I think because of our more desert kind of climate, we understand that overwatering is really problematic. And certainly losing the lawn makes a lot of sense. But you mentioned indexing, which I think is something that's not talked about enough. And what is the power and the potential in indexing sort of what we have and the value of that?
Well, I think it gives you a way to actually tell you when you're getting close to what you want. I mean, otherwise, how would you mark your progress? If we say that we want the city to be more like a natural environment, well, how much more? That's the question I would ask anyway. And then if you have some kind of goal like 10%, then you can move towards that goal and you can know when you're there. Which sorts of things to use for indices? There's all kinds of them out there. There's the Singapore Index, I think a lot of people have heard about, which is like a citywide or a city scale index on the biodiversity values in your city. Mine is super specialized in that it's a backyard level index that tells you how close you are to the baseline biodiversity that was here or that is here in the native areas around us. So I think that without some kind of quantification, there's no way to know how you're making progress, where you are in the scale of being close to a natural area.
Yeah, so I'd love to follow up on that, because it's something that unfortunately I couldn't share today because we're just sort of getting started in this, but we've kind of finished our first project from a design side, working with a consulting company called Ecometric Solution Group. They've been coming on to several of our projects to essentially explore the biocapacity of the project site, be it urban infield or just a plain greenfield site or brownfield site, and then measuring a healthy ecosystem nearby. And so going into some of the foothills of the West Hollywood Hills would be a great place to actually look at what does the preserved aspects of nature do for carbon sequestration, for creating evapotranspiration, for soil and erosion control. And then measuring our projects to see how well we're doing those exact same circumstances in those projects. And I think that's where, to your point, Dr. Brown, that's the only way that we can actually truly measure if we're creating a regenerative built environment, is if we truly understand the natural one that we're trying to emulate down to a quantified level.
Yeah, and of course we want to emulate the close by natural environment, because that is the one that's basically evolved in the site. It requires the fewest inputs and the fewest the least amount of energy money, and so on to sustain it. And it's
You
more
know, I think-
resilient, being more similar to the native environments.
Right, and I think you kind of make an interesting, note, and it'd be the interesting challenge, and which I'd be kind of curious to get your thoughts on, is that if while we may have lost those mythical lands, right? It's millennia of growth that has been taken away in the past 150 years. Can we be laying the seeds for like proper regrowth there? And then, how long is it going to take till we actually meet some of those standards?
Yeah, like having an urban oak woodland implies that you have oak trees, and that takes a long time.
Right.
And like Dr. Chen said, we should also be looking to the south of us to see what's coming, because we all assume that climates are going to be warmer.
Yeah.
So we have to also plan for the future.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We had a question come in. You made reference to the coastal live oak and sort of the woodlands associated with that. But you had also mentioned early in the talk the California sycamore and the black walnut as being native species. So would those also be of interest, equal interest? Black walnuts being deciduous.
Yeah, that was Travis who mentioned those forest types.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, those are all appropriate plants, trees for our area, of course, and will function much better. I mean, I don't know if you go out walking at night in your neighborhood, but if you do in the summertime, you can tell when you come near an oak tree just by the sounds of the insects, the tree crickets, and all the other nocturnal active orthoptera, we call them, crickets and grasshoppers. It's just like night and day. You can walk along and all of a sudden, that's a high functioning tree in terms of biodiversity.
Yeah. Love the sounds throughout the day. And even right now in the mornings, getting up at 5:30 or 6 and hearing the new hatchlings chirping as well. I think, it's amazing when we can experience that as part of the city still, and not lose that. So we had another question about biomimicry and building systems integration and how they might relate to building operations and sustainability. And are there lessons to be learned on the equipment and operational side of buildings?
Yeah, so there's a phenomenal project we did. This is less to do with urban forestry and much more to do with natural ventilation. We worked on the Anaheim Regional Transit Intermodal Center. It's one of the longest names, Artex. It's the first high-speed rail station in California down in Anaheim, and it'll get high-speed rail in, 30 to 50 years. But the inspiration for the building, which is a lamella structure with a lot of sort of pillowed ETFE domes, is that we looked at the black-capped chickadee, which actually begins to sort of change its sort of feather pressure to enable increased warmth or cool. And so we both have a building that has this sort of pillowed envelope that we can adjust pressures on over the course of the year to enable a better balance between indoor and outdoor environments. But we've also shaped it in a way to take advantage of the prevailing winds. And so we have louvers at both ends of the curtain wall that open and close. They've been functional for 5 years. There's been one issue of maintenance in total over that. And so even during last year's fire season, it was impressive to learn when we were actually touring a client through it, that they even kept that space open for most of the year. And that because just of the shape and form of it, they weren't getting too much particulates in, and that they were naturally kind of being flushed up rather than down into that space. And so there's a lot that we learn from natural forms, as well as how species maintain their own conditions of life to affect our conditions of building operations. And so there are ways not only for us to emulate natural systems in landscape, but natural systems in building structures and MEP systems.
Yeah, I think there's lots to be learned from nature in all aspects. And I'm assuming in that case, the energy reduction was significant, right?
Yeah, we looked at, we got a 45% reduction against the code baseline and a 60% reduction from 2005 standards.
Fantastic, fantastic. I do want to share, we got a note that LA Department of Sanitation has actually started a biodiversity index, back to the previous point about indexing. So that's,
Yeah, there's lots of them.
yeah, that's good to
That's
know.
awesome.
Okay, I think there was one other question we had. Sean, you had mentioned the green aspect ratio, and that's not a concept that is familiar to many. That was with respect to the Singapore project. So how is that codified? Is that actually a code requirement in Singapore? And
It is, and they have increased targets to essentially increase the amount of available green area, as well as now the amount of farming going on in Singapore. They actually want to generate 30% of their own food by 2030. And when that measure started, they were only at 2%. They're now up to, I think, it's either 5 or 7% over the course of the past 5 years. But for everyone else in the audience, just understanding that most codes around the US and around the world have some definition of how much open space we need at the ground level, what Rick and I were talking about earlier. But then also how much of that needs to be green, it needs to be natural, landscaped, or at least pervious to deal with stormwater management, as well as enable better response to urban heat island effects and biodiversity.
right. So when we talk about that ratio, we're really looking for some semblance of active green space on any particular development.
And that's where you see the green roofs initiatives that have happened throughout Los Angeles, San Francisco, in addition to or in lieu of renewable energy integration on rooftops.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I just ask, Singapore is reclaiming land a lot in the ocean. Is that where they're putting their food production?
Actually, most of the food production targets are in vertical farming. There's a phenomenal company called Sky Greens, actually the most unique founder. He founded the company, I think, in his late 60s. He's a retired civil engineer focusing on water management, and began creating a aeroponic a green roof system that vertically stacks farming. Unfortunately, Singapore has a lot of reclamation. Most of that is still towards shipping, energy generation, and other industrial means. That has its own sort of ecological challenges very clearly. But the goal right now for farming within Singapore is either essentially within buildings themselves, so using growth lights, in vertically stacked green roofs, or on the rooftops of buildings in more traditional either soil-based or hydroponically based farming.
And these are corporate entities. They're not integrated into private development, right? It's not like you'd have a vertical farm on a residential tower per se.
Well, that's this is Singapore, and they do some wild things like that. Unique thing in Singapore is once I think you're a little bit more on your own to start developing a good idea, but then once you've done it, Singapore kind of pushes its arm through it. I'm going to blank on exactly how much of Singapore's housing is sort of public urban housing, but it's around like 30 to 40%. And so a lot of those buildings are going to probably have green roofs on top of them through a variety of means. And many times that's viewed as a wonderful community amenity. But it will be interesting to note that it will be part of the production for food to service all of Singapore, not just for personal homes.
Yeah, and we touched on vegetative roofs earlier, and I think it's another tool in the toolbox, which is very important, but should be with a purpose. Whether it's wildlife propagation or food production, it can't just be sort of greenwashing, right? That we really want to get some sort of positive benefit if we're looking at building, rooftop garden spaces, for example. Or whatever it is, the ground floor. It's got to be
as much as we can, trying to look at using non-potable water towards it. The tremendous amount of recycled water from the city or within buildings themselves that can be well used towards that landscaping.
Absolutely. I think water and safe and sane reuse of water is the next frontier. That's so.
I like that. I like that term, safe and sane.
All right, well, I think I'd like to invite Dr. Longcore and Dr. Chen to rejoin us if we can, and we'll try to get to some of a few other of the community questions. Dr. Chen, I don't know if you wanted to follow up where we left off, because I didn't mean to short shrift your time there, but if you wanted to build off of the previous conversation, or should we go with some other questions that have come in?
Yeah, I think just one thing to add, the last question was about urban forestry policy, especially, when we have the tree removal and then when we think about tree canopy loss. Yeah, so I think, Travis addressed really well. It's not just about the funding, and it's related to policy as well and community engagement. And one thing, as you all know, when it comes to, urban forestry management, funding is definitely one of the challenge for lots of municipalities. And first of all, it happens very often we don't have lots of resources, especially, financial resource for urban forestry management. And secondly, when it comes to like a crisis, like, either financial crisis or pandemic crisis, urban forestry budget is always like the top one to be cut. And, this is one thing, we have been doing not just at the local level and also at the state and federal level. Two people have been trying to work with partners and to advocate, for more funding for urban forestry, not just urban forestry, urban greening as well, because we know it's really important. At the same time, and as one like article said, trees grow on money. Of course, we know money is grow on tree because it provides lots of benefits, right? At the same time, we need to have sufficient resources to support, either tree planting, tree care, and tree protection. So that's one thing, the funding part. And definitely it's related to policy, especially when it comes to tree removal, tree protection. We want to make sure we have, effective policy there. And the goal is, ideally you want to have no net loss of tree canopy, right? And so there are some like cities, there are different like better you could do. It's like when it comes to the tree protection, first of all, you want to have, I'm very glad to hear in the city of West Hollywood, we have, lots of good policies already in place. And also we have urban forestry management plan and other things too. So yeah, you want to have a good policy to protect not just trees on public property and also on private property too, especially if those trees are big, significant, healthy, and some of them may have historical values, as well. And for those trees, especially if they're native, tree species in the area, definitely, you want to pay more attention to those trees. And also when it comes to, tree replacement, and yeah, you want to have like no net loss tree canopy. And some cities, they do it like inch to inch. Some like they do it like canopy to canopy. But the goal is you don't want to, lose tree. And also every tree is different, right? When you remove a big tree and if you replace with a small tree, that's different. Like, many others said it takes really long time, right? For a tree to grow and to provide all the benefits. And think about it like the size of the tree, the species of the tree, and all the ecosystem, benefits this tree provide. And also not just the ordinance, and the policy, and also the, implementation part too, the enforcement, right? And we need to have effective, enforcement mechanism to make sure the policy could be implemented. And also there are studies, show, for example, Travis, shared the study they did here, and also most recently in Florida, the researchers from University of Florida, they found in Florida and for municipalities that have like tree protection ordinances, usually those communities have higher tree canopy. And this is like another example to show it's like why effective policy is so important, right? And also we have to be creative, and especially when it comes to the budget, when it comes to tree protection and also community engagement, because especially for budget, some municipalities that have certain percentage of general fund goes directly to urban forestry, program, because you want to be the sustainable. At the same time, with all the co-benefits and these three, provide, how can you work with others like sectors, right? When it comes to energy saving, when it comes to water, right? When it comes to carbon, how can we make sure, we got all the support and also work across different departments and to make sure, first of all, we could protect the one we already have and also increase the urban green space in the city and work with homeowner residents too, because when we look at urban forest as a whole, and for example, not just in LA, and it happens in other cities too, the percentage of privately owned tree actually is much higher, because for public owned tree, including street tree, park tree, and other public property. But when you look at urban forest as a whole, actually private owned tree, it has high percentage. So how can we, engage residents, landowner, right, to make sure we plant the right species at the same time, tree care. The one participant actually raised a really good point, tree care, because after planting, it's not done. That's just the beginning, right? You want to make sure your tree can survive and can develop to full tree canopy, provide all the benefits you need, right? That's why we all need to work together. And that's another reason, I'm glad we're having this conversation here, right? And not just with experts, and also with, our community members here, and to learn more about the need and to share more information, knowledge, and also to discuss the strategies to move forward.
Yeah, and I think these are really good points. And I would say there's some good news on the West Hollywood side. On the policy side, there has been a strong commitment from our council and our community historically, not only through our management plan, but we have a Greening West Hollywood program. I mentioned earlier the Heritage Tree Program affords basically free advice to private property owners about tree care, tree pruning. We have, I think, 3 or 4 certified arborists as part of our staff. So we have a very, very knowledgeable staff that we're very, very blessed with. And on the funding side, we've maintained our funding levels. Our council's been very committed to that. And we have regular tree pruning, tree maintenance, median planting, park augmentation. We're always looking to expand green space. So in West Hollywood, we're a very fortunate community on the policy side because of that. So Dr. Brown, we had a question for you. Native oaks and sycamores are threatened by shot hole borers. What are we going to do to maintain native species? Talk a little bit more about, that challenge, and perhaps Dr. Longcore, you can jump in as well.
Yeah, that's a tough one when we get invasive species coming in and taking out our shade trees. I mean, if you're a tree, I go to the Southern California entomologist meeting sometimes, and once you sit through one of those meetings, you just conclude that if you're a native tree, you're screwed. I mean, there's oak pests, there's palm pests, there's citrus pests, there's all kinds of insects that are coming to affect our local trees. So, boy, that's a big problem. I think that what we have to do is to try and minimize those sorts of introductions of pests from other parts of the world through, the importation restrictions. That's really important for not bringing in pests from other parts of the world, locally sourcing our trees that we're planting. And I don't have a very good answer for that one. Native biodiversity is supposed to be more resilient. So if we use native species that are exposed to new pests and new pathogens, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. I just wanted to put in one more plug for the non-tree elements as well. There's certain shrubs like toyon and so on that are almost tree-sized that can function in similar ways without taking up quite as much space as trees. and have huge amounts of wildlife value.
And cooling value. Yeah, so on that point, you know, even the people who work directly on shot hole borer on the research side don't say that you shouldn't plant trees that are susceptible to shot hole borer, because taking care of your trees makes them more likely to survive and less susceptible to infestation. And so there shouldn't be trees that we put on the sort of do not plant list. I see it being used sort of as an excuse to avoid using natives, frankly. When that's clearly not the message. If you look at the integrated pest management stuff coming out of UC Riverside that specializes in this, it's not a do not plant list. So I would say that. And also I think, you know, getting beyond sort of just trees as trees, thinking about birds, because you know, Sean has talked about how there's inspiration that comes from birds, but there's also the things that our design does to birds, either good or bad, like all the glass on those structures. Unless you've taken specific steps to reduce collisions, those are going to be killing birds left. Unless you're controlling the light emissions at night, you're going to be attracting migratory birds that then run into the glass during the day. If you don't, we have tools to deal with all of this. It just has to be part of the ethos and built in from the start, that while we're taking our inspiration from nature, that we're also, you know, protecting the very groups that we're taking our inspiration from. And this goes to our tree choices as well, because even if we go beyond sort of the strictly natives, for a particular location, there are lots of trees that do better than others in terms of serving as the current function of the sort of urban forest in Los Angeles as habitat for migratory species. And I'd refer everybody to the work that Eric Wood and his students at the Wood Lab at Cal State LA has done in Los Angeles, specifically identifying both native species are better for our migratory birds that come here and winter and then go back and breed in places of forests in the Pacific Northwest, et cetera. But there are also sort of near natives, in other words, the same genus as one of our native species. So like a southern live oak, if a coast live oak isn't appropriate, maybe a southern live oak is. And that these are some also the genera that are going to get the most insects on them as well, and avoiding species that are from, you know, have been shown to basically be kind of barren from a biodiversity perspective. And unfortunately, part of the discussion in urban forestry is often around, you know, sort of diversifying the urban forest. There means bringing in species from other places around the world, and it talk about values. This is where the people who are interested in biodiversity, we sort of bang our heads against the wall, because to us that's not helpful, because they become, you know, I think Brian referred to them as inert. I sometimes refer to some like ice plant from South Africa as like, it's like ecological styrofoam, right? It takes up space, but it doesn't do really any good. And so we have guidance now on that. So recognizing that you can't necessarily grow a native tree every single location. We have shrubs as well, and they're important and they're much more water wise. But we also can go to these species that at least are from the continent and are going to be supporting more insects that then support more birds. So I just want to sort of bring those up about the need, and then to get people engaged with this issue, just follow on the bird thing, is let's start paying attention and documenting this. And there are tools to help you do this now. iNaturalist, it's iNaturalist.org, just the letter I, naturalist, where people can take a photograph, upload it, get it identified by an expert or even by this sort of computer artificial intelligence in the system, and document. And this ties into what the city of Los Angeles is doing now. I was involved in getting a biodiversity motion through the city of LA City Sanitation and Environment. Originally, you know, I proposed we do the Singapore Index that Brian had mentioned, and LA has now taken that Singapore Index and modified it for the region and for the size of the city, and is doing, I think, some really important work on pushing this forward so that there's going to be an LA biodiversity index. And there's a big report that everybody can download that's going to be quite relevant to the to the region and to West Hollywood is not because LA City covers such a large area that's on the city sanitation website. It's called the 2020 Biodiversity Report that goes into these issues and really grapples with the whole range of questions that we've been talking about here today, including the benefits of urban forest as sort of ecosystem services, but also deeply into all these other species that we share the landscape with. So iNaturalist is a way that you can get involved. The city of LA is going to be using iNaturalist data in their tracking of biodiversity over time. And the other tool is eBird.org, which is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's a little more for sort of birders, it is for birders specifically, and a way that we use when we're going around trying to assess either the potential of a development site to support birds. Like if I were consulting to Sean on a project, like saying, what can I do in this area? I'd immediately be going to eBird and iNaturalist and whatnot and figure out that local context in addition to whatever site observations you have, because the cumulative eyes of a community to document its own natural environment is far greater than any person going out on a day and trying to see what's going on. And the Natural History Museum promotes and uses iNaturalist a lot. There's a competition coming up where LA is one of cities around the world that's competing for the most observations in a week. And it's called the City Nature Challenge that everybody can get involved with as a beginner. Go out and take pictures of nature in your neighborhood, upload it, and you get to learn and connect with other people who are paying attention and caring about it at the same time.
Yeah,
So
we have a number of
Yeah, go ahead.
public programs like that. The Rascals program about reptiles and amphibians in Southern California, and the Slime program about snails living in, snails living in metropolitan environments.
And are those both app-based?
Yes.
Yeah, so in other words, as a community member, just the power of your phone to take a picture and upload it on these websites really contribute to the building of the knowledge and awareness and potential futures. I think it's fascinating that it doesn't seem too hard to really contribute in that way. I'm really glad you mentioned that. So I wanted to follow up on the City Nature Challenge. So specifically, what are the dates where community members can actually participate in this challenge?
I should know that, but I don't. I would say look at our website at nhm.org, and you'll find all the information about the City Nature Challenge.
Yeah, it's coming right up. Where is 2021? Where are the dates? Starting on April 30th. And LA County, I think, is registered as one entity. So all of this, whether we're inside West Hollywood or in another one of the 88 cities or unincorporated county, we're all competing against San Francisco and Cape Town and Singapore and whatnot to get people engaged in paying attention and documenting nature. So and then there's a period of time for identifying observations after that. So it starts on April 30th.
Okay, this Friday for a week.
Yeah, it's citynaturechallenge.org, all run together.
Well, one of the themes today that's come up several times is balance, right? Like how do we find that? Dr. Chen, you talked about the green, blue, brown balance, and I think Sean, you mentioned the balance between climate, culture, and aesthetics. We are going to grow. We have a state mandate to house more people. So that it isn't, should this happen, but it's going to happen. And so how do we find that balance where we actually are better off because of that growth? And I think that's the biggest question that's on many of our staff mind in the city of West Hollywood. But in terms of that balance, maybe Sean, I'll go back to you again. In an urban infill setting, when so many of our parcels are smaller, is that really possible with all the kind of competing goals that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question about it that it's a challenge, right? We had wonderful news this week with, between the U.S. rejoining the Paris Climate Change Accord, this goal of being 50%, carbon reductions by 2030. But I think Dr. Brown said it well earlier. We need to know more about the natural biocapacity of areas around us in order to bring that into the urban sphere. And I think what's important to note is that whether it's a small building footprint or a large one, that when we go vertical, I think the opportunities to integrate nature at multiple stages and tiers becomes the way that we can do this. And so, we have some sites where we're only looking at 15 to 25,000 feet. So there might not be that great of an opportunity for open space at that ground level. But if that building is going up 10 to 15 stories, well, taking, 1,000 square feet of that on each of those stories, well, that's about as much as that entire site alone. So we need to start, thinking about creatively, architects, how do we develop and work with developers towards that? But I think it's, looking for the city to start instituting codes that begin requiring some of those new mandates. I think it's, and then working with developers to incentivize them around hitting those marks. If our goal needs to be not doing less harm, but trying to do good, right? To restore some of these wonderful ecological areas, we need to start thinking about positive performance today. Not, doing, worse, doing less worse and then getting to better. We just need to just start doing better.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that struck me earlier, I think, Dr. Longcore, you showed a map that the tree people mapping, and in West Hollywood specific, the most, how do I say this? The greatest percentage of denser urban forest are really in our single family areas, in the West Hollywood West area, and then from Plummer Park over through Fuller, Poinsettia, Greenacre, those streets there, which are primarily single family. And yet the state, through ADU laws and other initiatives, have opened up the door to add, 2, 3, sometimes up to 4 units on these parcels. And going forward, there's sort of a sense that they are the lower density areas are the ones that have potential for growth. But given that, the backyards of these properties in particular do have a high percentage, is that cause for concern? In particular, if these single family neighborhoods become developed?
Well, I mean, let's look at it this way. All that legislation was put through in a way that exempted it from the microscope of environmental review. And there's a reason that they did that, because there's adverse consequences to this legislation, things like AB 9 and 10 right now. As well, there is no question that these are policies that have environmental harms to them. And normally the reason we have environmental review processes is so that we can identify those harms and figure out how we're going to mitigate them. And when you make changes that fundamentally change local land use, zoning, square foot, setbacks, etc., and you don't do any assessment and you exempt it from any further assessment, you're going to have adverse consequences that come out of it. So these kinds of initiatives are a recipe for cities that are hotter, for cities that have more stormwater runoff, for cities that have more air pollution, and for cities that consume more energy. Because even if you have a single family neighborhood and you think, well, we could put more people there, it is serving a purpose already as cooling its surroundings, because the benefits of trees and dense tree canopy doesn't extend just to the parcel that the tree is on. Cumulatively, this contributes to keeping this urban heat island effect at bay. So I would say that these are, just from sort of straight empirical perspective, These are policies that have environmental consequences that haven't been planned and mitigated. Now, I'm not going to tell you how one would mitigate those impacts necessarily, because there are many choices about how to do it. But I think the point that you make, is this a problem? Is yes, it is a problem. And this is what you've got to grapple with here. And I also like to think a little bit longer term, bigger picture. We're closer to a steady state or decreasing population on the planet than we are to the founding of Los Angeles. Right? We're closer to having to maintain a steady state environment globally than we are to a perpetual, than the time we've been running a perpetual growth environment. And so I'd like to step back and say, well, when we get there, and maybe it's 100 years, or maybe it's 120 years, or something like that, when human population has stabilized and consumption hopefully has stabilized or decreased dramatically with it, or we've forced ourselves into decreasing our consumption through what we've done to the environment, we're going to look back today and say, what did we wish we had done for that steady state, so that we plan from what's the vision, what's our role here in a future where we're not built on perpetual growth, and what will we wish we had done now to set things up? Is it big open spaces and connectivity, but ignore the cities and make the cities as dense as they can possibly be with no nature? That's one option. And that's the vision of some people that I think I see out there. I don't see that as the best option, because to me, that disconnects people from the world and the things that I care about and have learned to care about through interacting with them. But I think having this sort of bigger, larger discussion about sustainability, that isn't how can we sustain our growth perpetually, because we can't, but how do we get to an environment that we will be happy that we have when we do get to a point where we've stabilized, and where's the water coming from, especially in places like this, that and really come to question. So all by way of saying, policy decisions that simply make changes and ignore their environmental consequences are incredibly short-sighted.
Well said.
Here, here.
So on that note, on the what do we wish we had done, thinking through, we have an elected listening in all ears. Are there thoughts of, Dr. Brown, you had made a few recommendations specifically, and one of them was indexing, and I'm curious, is West Hollywood too small to index, given the county index that's going on? Is it too small of a subset, or would it be worth to explore indexing West Hollywood?
The backyard is not too small to index, so certainly West Hollywood is an appropriate area to try and work together to try and increase its biodiversity, or try to make changes that are positive for its biodiversity. I think that would take a lot of discussion and planning with people like Travis involved, who have a lot of experience in that kind of work.
And can I just add something to that? I think we should think about these issues, biodiversity, conservation in general, how we interact with the natural world, not as a binary interaction where it's like, there's reserves and here's people, but that nature and conservation and biodiversity initiatives are a fractal that is at every single level. Fractals are things that have a similar pattern as you zoom in on them, like on a coastline. You see the big pattern, you zoom in, and there's a similar pattern at a smaller scale and a smaller scale. So that means we can have global biodiversity plans. We can have national, regional, state, county, city, neighborhood. And the reason for that is that fractals really are designed like an oak tree that Sean was mentioning. They maximize the interaction between the fractal and its surroundings, like the leaves of an oak going out and getting out the most sunlight. And so I'd like to think about biodiversity conservation, and even that's just a 10-cent word, just nature interactions with people have to be on this fractal, so that your your lot or your balcony is that first level. And then, what are you doing in your neighborhood? And you can set sort of standards for this. Let's have a goal of, 10% tree canopy and this amount of, migratory bird species at different levels that are appropriate. So no, it's not too small to index by far. And it's the only way that we engage. If we don't see this as something that's separate, that's binary, but something that permeates like a circulatory system, that nature is a circulatory system, that gets a little bit of nature endorphins to everybody, no matter where they are in the world, just like the circulatory system gets oxygen to cells wherever they are in the body. And circulatory systems also a fractal, right? Small pieces into bigger pieces into bigger pieces. So I'd really start thinking about it that way, and especially given the unique leadership that West Hollywood can have as basically a city that is, like developed out. There's no big natural open spaces in West Hollywood. And so you've got to embrace this from the start, that it's part of the whole conservation fractal, and that you have responsibility for this part that is really the capillaries that's getting nature down to people in their lives and enriching them and, increasing their well-being.
And my recommendation would be to pick a core area, like a starting core area for a biodiversity project. Maybe you could figure out some place where you could do no summer watering for a period of time, a neighborhood, a public area, whatever, and try to extend wildlife values into the city that way.
Well, yeah, but I think the interesting is to sort of start mapping out where the biodiversity corridor could be. So if you're looking and you're mapping all of those micro scale biodiversity sheds from people's backyards to larger plots of land, right? How do you start creating that linkage? And so to your point, Dr. Brown, sort of like, how do you then sort of say, let's emphasize growth around a specific area as that first pilot case where you can have the biggest impact?
Diversity growth.
Yeah.
All right. So before I turn it over to Mayor Pro Tem Meister to finish, I'm sorry, Dr. Chen, do you want to have one last comment?
Oh yeah, I just want to follow up with Dr. Brown said about the pilot. Yeah, so for example, in the city of LA, actually, the city is doing some pilot project and to look at, wildlife corridor and also conservation. And it's, of course, it's related to, the green space, everything as well. Yeah, it's always, to start with like a pilot, and then you can look at like a citywide strategy based on that.
And considering our size city, we should be able to put forward something like this because we don't have the bureaucracies that cities like Los Angeles have. So I'm very excited about this.
That's great.
And I just wanted to say, Dr. Brown, if only I had the power.
Well, maybe you can convince a block of homeowners to do something together.
Absolutely.
Well, we do have a very active community in West Hollywood who do care about these topics, and I think the attendance today shows that, as well as many others who either work or are interested in what West Hollywood's doing, who have joined us. So before I turn it over to Mayor Pro Tem Meister, I want to thank all our speakers today. This was a really great conversation, starting with the global, then coming down to the level of the city and how we build and how we go forward and trying to maintain that balance. I think there's been a number of very important themes, and I really appreciate the questions that have come in from the community. Hopefully we can have more of these conversations. And so before we go, though, I think we want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the city and next steps. So I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Pro Tem Meister, and I think we have there we go, slide coming up. So Mayor Pro Tem, thank you so much, everybody.
On behalf of the city, I want to thank Rick and our outstanding speakers. This was just a really fantastic conversation. The city has many, many ways to get involved in improving our environment, and we've done a lot. However, there's definitely more that we can do on this front, like more shade trees. My thoughts on balance is that where there's a will, there's a way. It's about priorities, and you're right, it's about policies and codes and taking very seriously the future of our city and ultimately our planet. I'd love for staff to share a link to this symposium with our state policymakers, with developers, and surrounding municipalities, as well as posting on our website, because I think the conversation we had today needs to be spread around. On the screen, you can see many of the city's current programs. I just want to highlight a few of these. One of my personal favorites is the Certified Wildlife Habitats program. This program encourages certified wildlife habitats on both public and private property in West Hollywood, turning a yard, balcony, container garden, schoolyard, work landscape, or roadside green space into a certified wildlife habitat. We're promoting it. It's fun, it's easy, and it can make a lasting difference for our city's wildlife. Another program is our Parkway Design Standards. In the past year, the City Council adopted new design standards for residents to improve their parkways in front of their properties to be more environmentally friendly. Another favorite of mine is the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. It's a commitment by our city to create habitat for the monarch butterfly and pollinators, and to educate residents about how they can make a difference at home and in their community. Dr. Longcar, I'd like to thank you for bringing up iNaturalist. I was going to bring it up as well, that it lets you upload a photo of anything you see onto your phone or computer, map where you saw it, tag it, make notes about behavior, and then naturalists from all over the world can work to identify what you saw. And how cool is that, West Hollywood, to start logging in your observations so that we and the rest of the world can actually see the diversity of species that we have living here. I believe our next slide has our city staff contact information. Great. So please, to our audience watching, reach out to city staff if you want more information on any of the programs that you just saw on the screen. And speaking of city staff, we have Rick Abramson, Helen Collins, Robin Eason, Jackie Rocco. We have the city's website, weho.org, go green. And we want to hear from the public. We are, again, excited about the idea of really trying to make the city has been a leader, but we have to continue that leadership and stewardship of our city's environment. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you all.
Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.